This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 16. Under Arrest. As Carthoris, Exodarm, Tars Tarkas, and I stood gazing at the magnificent vessel which meant so much to all of us, we saw a second and then a third top the summit of the hills and glide gracefully after their sister. Now a score of one-man air scouts were launching from the upper decks of the nearer vessel, and in a moment more were speeding in long swift dives to the ground about us. In another instant we were surrounded by armed sailors, and an officer had stepped forward to address us, when his eyes fell upon Carthoris. With an exclamation of surprised pleasure, he sprang forward, and placing his hands upon the boy's shoulder, called him by name. "Carthoris, my prince!" he cried. "Caor, Caor! Horvastus greets the son of Dejah Thoris, princess of Helium, and of her husband John Carter. Where have you been, O my prince? All Helium has plunged in sorrow. Terrible have been the calamities that have befallen your great-grandsire's mighty nation since the fatal day that saw you leave our midst." "Grieve not, my good Horvastus," cried Carthoris, "since I bring not back myself alone to cheer my mother's heart and the hearts of my beloved people, but also one whom all Barsoom loved best, her greatest warrior and her savior, John Carter, Prince of Helium." Horvastus turned in the direction indicated by Carthoris, and as his eyes fell upon me he was like to have collapsed from sheer surprise. "John Carter!" he exclaimed, and then a sudden troubled look came into his eyes. "My prince," he started, "where hast thou—" And then he stopped, but I knew the question that his lips dared not frame. The loyal fellow would not be the one to force from mine a confession of the terrible truth that I had returned from the bosom of the Ish, the river of mystery, back from the shore of the lost sea of Chorus and the Valley Dor. "Ah, my prince," he continued, as though no thought had interrupted his greeting, "that you are back is sufficient, and let Horvastus' sword have the high honor of being first at thy feet." With these words the noble fellow unbuckled his scabbard and flung his sword upon the ground before me. Could you know the customs and the character of Red Martians, you would appreciate the depth of meaning that that simple act conveyed to me and to all about us who witnessed it. The thing was equivalent to saying, "My sword, my body, my life, my soul are yours to do with as you wish. Until death and after death I look to you alone for authority for my every act. Be you right or wrong, your word shall be my only truth. Whoso raises his hand against you must answer to my sword." It is the oath of fealty that men occasionally pay to a Jeddak whose high character and chivalrous acts have inspired the enthusiastic love of his followers. Never had I known this high tribute paid to a lesser mortal. There was but one response possible. I stooped and lifted the sword from the ground, raised the hilt to my lips, and then, stepping to Horvastus, I buckled the weapon upon him with my own hands. "Horvastus," I said, placing my hand upon his shoulder, "you know best the promptings of your own heart. That I shall need your sword I have little doubt, but accept from John Carter upon his sacred honor the assurance that he will never call upon you to draw the sword other than in the cause of truth, justice, and righteousness." "That I knew, my prince," he replied, "ere ever I threw my beloved blade at thy feet." As we spoke, other fliers came and went between the ground and the battleship, and presently a larger boat was launched from above, one capable of carrying a dozen persons, perhaps, and dropped lightly near us. As she touched, an officer sprang from her deck to the ground, and advancing to Horvastus, saluted. "Cantos Can desires that this party whom we have rescued be brought immediately to the deck of the Exavarian," he said. As we approached the little craft, I looked about for the members of my party, and for the first time noticed that Thuvia was not among them. Questioning elicited the fact that none had seen her since Carthoris had sent her thoat galloping madly toward the hills, in the hope of carrying her out of harm's way. Immediately Horvastus dispatched a dozen air scouts in as many directions to search for her. It could not be possible that she had gone far since we had last seen her. We others stepped to the deck of the craft that had been sent to fetch us, and a moment later we were upon the Exavarian. The first man to greet me was Cantos Can himself. My old friend had won to the highest place in the navy of Helium, but he was still to me the same brave comrade who had shared with me the privations of a war-hewn dungeon. the terrible atrocities of the great games, and later the dangers of our search for Dejathoros within the hostile city of Zodanga. Then I had been an unknown wanderer upon a strange planet, and he a simple padwar in the navy of Helium. Today he commanded all Helium's great terrors of the skies, and I was a prince of the house of Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. He did not ask me where I had been. Like Horvastus, he too dreaded the truth, and would not be the one to wrest a statement from me. That it must come sometime he well knew, but until it came he seemed satisfied to but know that I was with him once more. He greeted Carthoris and Tars Tarkas with the keenest delight, but he asked neither where he had been. He could scarcely keep his hands off the boy. "You do not know, John Carter," he said to me, "how we of Helium love this son of yours. It is as though all the great love we bore his noble father and his poor mother had been centered in him. When it became known that he was lost, 10 million people wept." "What mean you, Cantos Can?" I whispered. "By his poor mother." For the words had seemed to carry a sinister meaning which I could not fathom. He drew me to one side. "For a year," he said, "ever since Carthoris disappeared, Dejathoros has grieved and mourned for her lost boy. The blow of years ago, when you did not return from the atmosphere plant, was lessened to some extent by the duties of motherhood, for your son broke his white shell that very night. That she suffered terribly then all Helium knew, for did not all Helium suffer with her the loss of her lord? But with the boy gone, there was nothing left, and after expedition upon expedition returned with the same hopeless tale of no clue as to his whereabouts, our beloved princess drooped lower and lower, until all who saw her felt that it could be but a matter of days ere she went to join her loved ones within the precincts of the Valley Dor. As a last resort, Mors Kajak, her father, and Tardos Mors, her grandfather, took command of 2 mighty expeditions, and a month ago sailed away to explore every inch of ground in the northern hemisphere of Barsoom. For 2 weeks no word has come back from them, but rumors were rife that they had met with a terrible disaster, and that all were dead. About this time Zataris renewed his importunities for her hand in marriage. He has been forever after her since you disappeared. She hated him and feared him, but with both her father and grandfather gone, Zataris was very powerful, for he is still Jed of Zodanga, to which position, you will remember, Tardos Mors appointed him, after you had refused the honor. He had a secret audience with her 6 days ago. What took place none knows, but the next day Dejathoros had disappeared, and with her had gone a dozen of her household guard and body servants, including Sola the Green Woman, Tars Tarkas' daughter, you recall. No word left they of their intentions, but it is always thus with those who go upon the voluntary pilgrimage from which none returns. We cannot think aught than that Dejathoros has sought the icy bosom of Ish, and that her devoted servants have chosen to accompany her. Zataris was at Helium when she disappeared. He commands this fleet which has been searching for her since. No trace of her have we found, and I fear that it be a futile quest." While we talked, Horvastus's fliers were returning to the Exavarian. Not one, however, had discovered a trace of Thuvia. I was much depressed over the news of Dejathoros' disappearance, and now there was added the further burden of apprehension concerning the fate of this girl, whom I believed to be the daughter of some proud Barsoomian house, and it had been my intention to make every effort to return her to her people. I was about to ask Cantos Can to prosecute a further search for her, when a flyer from the flagship of the fleet arrived at the Exavarian with an officer bearing a message to Cantos Can from Aris. My friend read the dispatch and then turned to me. "Zataris commands me to bring our prisoners before him. There is naught else to do. He is supreme in Helium, yet it would be far more in keeping with chivalry and good taste were he to come hither and greet the Saviour of Barsoom with the honors that are his due." "You know full well, my friend," I said, smiling, "that Zataris has good cause to hate me. Nothing would please him better than to humiliate me and then to kill me. Now that he has so excellent an excuse, let us go and see if he has the courage to take advantage of it." Summoning Carthoris, Tars Tarkas, and Exodar, we entered the small flyer with Cantos Can and Zataris' officer, and in a moment we were stepping to the deck of Zataris' flagship. As we approached the Jed of Zodanga, no sign of greeting or recognition crossed his face. Not even to Carthoris did he vouchsafe a friendly word. His attitude was cold, haughty, and uncompromising. "Kaor, Zataris," I said in greeting, but he did not respond. Why were these prisoners not disarmed? He asked Ch18 Can. They are not prisoners, Zadars, replied the officer. 2 of them are of Helium's noblest family. Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, is Tardos Mors' best beloved ally. The other is a friend and companion of the Prince of Helium. That is enough for me to know. It is not enough for me, however, retorted Zadars. More must I hear from those who have taken the pilgrimage than their names. Where have you been, John Carter? I have just come from the Valley Dor and the land of the firstborn, Zadars, I replied. Ah! He exclaimed in evident pleasure. You do not deny it, then. You have returned from the bosom of Ish. I have come back from a land of false hope, from a valley of torture and death. With my companions I have escaped from the hideous clutches of lying fiends. I have come back to the Barsoom that I saved from a painless death to again save her, but this time from death in its most frightful form. Cease, blasphemer, cried Zadars. Hope not to save thy cowardly carcass by inventing horrid lies to... But he got no further. One does not call John Carter coward and liar thus lightly, and Zadars should have known it. Before a hand could be raised to stop me, I was at his side, and one hand grasped his throat. Come I from heaven or hell, Zadars, you will find me still the same John Carter that I've always been, nor did ever man call me such names and live without apologizing. And with that I commenced to bend him back across my knee and tighten my grip upon his throat. Seize him, cried Zadars, and a dozen officers sprang forward to assist him. Ch18 Can came close and whispered to me, Desist, I beg of you. It will but involve us all, for I cannot see these men lay hands upon you without aiding you. My officers and men will join me, and we shall have a mutiny then, that may lead to the revolution. For the sake of Tardos Mors and Helium, desist. At his words I released Zadars, and turning my back upon him, walked toward the ship's rail. Come, Ch18 Can, I said. The Prince of Helium would return to the Exavarian. None interfered. Zadars stood white and trembling amidst his officers. Some there were who looked upon him with scorn and drew toward me, while one, a man long in the service and confidence of Tardos Mors, spoke to me in a low tone as I passed him. You may count my medal among your fighting men, John Carter, he said. I thanked him and passed on. In silence we embarked, and shortly after stepped once more upon the deck of the Exavarian. 15 minutes later we received orders from the flagship to proceed toward Helium. Our journey thither was uneventful. Carthoris and I were wrapped in the gloomiest of thoughts. Ch18 Can was somber in contemplation of the further calamity that might fall upon Helium should Zadars attempt to follow the age-old precedent that allotted a terrible death to fugitives from the Valley Dor. Tars Tarkas grieved for the loss of his daughter. Exedar alone was carefree, a fugitive and outlaw. He could be no worse off in Helium than elsewhere. Let us hope that we may at least go out with good red blood upon our blades, he said. It was a simple wish, and one most likely to be gratified. Among the officers of Exavarian I thought I could discern division into fractions ere we had reached Helium. There were those who gathered about Carthoris and myself whenever the opportunity presented, while about an equal number held aloof from us. They offered us only the most courteous treatment, but were evidently bound by their superstitious belief in the doctrine of Dor and Ish and Chorus. I could not blame them, for I knew how strong a hold a creed, however ridiculous it may be, may gain upon an otherwise intelligent people. By returning from Dor we had committed a sacrilege. By recounting our adventures there, and stating the facts as they existed, we had outraged the religion of their fathers. We were blasphemers, lying heretics. Even those who still clung to us from personal love and loyalty, I think, did so in the face of the fact that at heart they questioned our veracity. It is very hard to accept a new religion for an old, no matter how alluring the promises of the new may be. But to reject the old as a tissue of falsehoods without being offered anything in its stead is indeed a most difficult thing to ask of any people. Ch18 Can would not talk of our experiences among the Therns and the firstborn. It is enough, he said, that I jeopardize my life here and hereafter by countenancing you all. Do not ask me to add still further to my sins by listening to what I've always been taught was the rankest heresy. I knew that sooner or later the time must come when our friends and enemies would be forced to declare themselves openly. When we reached Helium, there must be an accounting, and if Tardos Mors had not returned, I feared that the enmity of Zadaris might weigh heavily against us, for he represented the government of Helium. To take sides against him were equivalent to treason. The majority of the troops would doubtless follow the lead of their officers, and I knew that many of the highest and most powerful men of both land and air forces would cleave to John Carter in the face of God, man, or devil. On the other hand, the majority of the populace unquestionably would demand that we pay the penalty of our sacrilege. The outlook seemed dark from whatever angle I viewed it, but my mind was so torn with anguish at the thought of Dejah Thoris that I realized now that I gave the terrible question of Helium's plight but scant attention at that time. There was always before me, day and night, a horrible nightmare of the frightful scenes through which I knew my princess might even then be passing, the horrid plantmen, the ferocious white apes. At times I would cover my face with my hands in a vain effort to shut out the fearful thing from my mind. It was in the forenoon that we arrived above the mile-high scarlet tower which marks Greater Helium from her twin city. As we descended in great circles toward the navy docks, a mighty multitude could be seen surging in the streets beneath. Helium had been notified by radio aerogram of our approach. From the deck of the Exavarian, we four, Carthoris, Tars Tarkas, Exodar, and I, were transferred to a lesser flyer to be transported to quarters within the Temple of Reward. It is here that Martian justice is meted to benefactor or malefactor. Here the hero is decorated. Here the felon is condemned. We were taken into the temple from the landing stage upon the roof, so that we did not pass among the people at all, as is customary. Always before I had seen prisoners of note or returned wanderers of eminence paraded from the gate of Jedex to the Temple of Reward, up the broad avenue of ancestors, through dense crowds of jeering or cheering citizens. I knew that Zadaris dared not trust the people near to us, for he feared that their love for Carthoris and myself might break into a demonstration which would wipe out their superstitious horror of the crime we were to be charged with. What his plans were I could only guess, but that they were sinister was evidenced by the fact that only his most trusted servitors accompanied us upon the flyer to the Temple of Reward. We were lodged in a room upon the south side of the temple, overlooking the avenue of ancestors, down which we could see the full length to the gate of Jedex, 5 miles away. The people in the temple plaza and in the streets for a distance of a full mile were standing as close packed as it was possible for them to get. They were very orderly. There were neither scoffs nor plaudits, and when they saw us at the window above them, there were many who buried their faces in their arms and wept. Late in the afternoon a messenger arrived from Zadaris to inform us that we would be tried by an impartial body of nobles in the great hall of the temple at the Verse Zod, on the following day, or at about 8:40 a.m. Earth time. Wherever Captain Carter has used Martian measurements of time, distance, weight, and the like, I have translated them into as nearly their equivalent in earthly values as is possible. His notes contain many Martian tables and a great volume of scientific data, but since the International Astronomical Society is at present engaged in classifying, investigating, and verifying this vast fund of remarkable and valuable information, I have felt that it will add nothing to the interest of Captain Carter's story or to the sum total of human knowledge to maintain a strict adherence to the original manuscript in these matters, while it might readily confuse the reader and detract from the interest of the history. For those who may be interested, however, I will explain that the Martian day is a trifle over 24 hours 37 minutes duration, Earth time. This the Martians divide into 10 equal parts, commencing the day at about 6 a.m., Earth time. The Zodes are divided into 50 shorter periods, each of which in turn is composed of 200 brief periods of time, about equivalent to the earthly second. The Barsoomian table of time, as here given, is but a part of the full table appearing in Captain Carter's notes. Table: 200 tals, 1 x, 50 x, 1 zode, 10 zodes, 1 revolution of Mars upon its axis. End of Chapter 16.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars. written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 17. The Death Sentence. A few moments before the appointed time on the following morning, a strong guard of Zadarus' officers appeared at our quarters to conduct us to the great hall of the temple. In twos we entered the chamber and marched down the broad aisle of hope, as it is called, to the platform in the center of the hall. Before and behind us marched armed guards, while three solid ranks of Zodangan soldiery lined either side of the aisle from the entrance to the rostrum. As we reached the raised enclosure, I saw our judges. As is the custom upon Barsoom, there were 31, supposedly selected by lot from men of the noble class, for nobles were on trial. But to my amazement, I saw no single friendly face among them. Practically all were Zodangans, and it was I to whom Zodanga owed her defeat at the hands of the Green Hordes, and her subsequent vassalage to Helium. There could be little justice here for John Carter, or his son, or for the great Thark who had commanded the savage tribesmen who overran Zodanga's broad avenues, looting, burning, and murdering. About us, the vast circular coliseum was packed to its full capacity. All classes were represented, all ages and both sexes. As we entered the hall, the hum of subdued conversation ceased until as we halted upon the platform, or throne of righteousness, the silence of death enveloped the 10,000 spectators. The judges were seated in a great circle about the periphery of the circular platform. We were assigned seats with our backs toward a small platform in the exact center of the larger one. This placed us facing the judges and the audience. Upon the smaller platform, each would take his place while his case was being heard. Zadarus himself sat in the golden chair of the presiding magistrate. As we were seated and our guards retired to the foot of the stairway leading to the platform, he arose and called my name. "John Carter," he cried, "take your place upon the pedestal of truth to be judged impartially, according to your acts, and here to know the reward you have earned thereby." Then turning to and fro toward the audience, he narrated the acts upon the value of which my reward was to be determined. "Know you, O judges and people of Helium," he said, "that John Carter, one time Prince of Helium, has returned by his own statement from the Valley Dor, and even from the temple of Ishus itself. That, in the presence of many men of Helium, he has blasphemed against the sacred Ish, and against the Valley Dor, and the lost sea of Chorus, and the holy Therns themselves, and even against Ishus, goddess of death and of life eternal. And know you further, by witness of thine own eyes, that see him here now, upon the pedestal of truth, that he has indeed returned from these sacred precincts, in the face of our ancient customs, and in violation of the sanctity of our ancient religion. He who be once dead may not live again. He who attempts it must be made dead forever. Judges, your duty lies plain before you. Here can be no testimony in contravention of truth. What reward shall be meted to John Carter in accordance with the acts he has committed?" "Death!" shouted one of the judges. And then a man sprang to his feet in the audience, and raising his hand on high, cried, "Justice! Justice! Justice!" It was Cantos Can, and as all eyes turned toward him, he leaped past the Zodangan soldiery and sprang upon the platform. "What manner of justice be this?" he cried to Zadarus. "The defendant has not been heard, nor has he had an opportunity to call others in his behalf. In the name of the people of Helium, I demand fair and impartial treatment for the Prince of Helium." A great cry arose from the audience then, "Justice! Justice! Justice!" and Zadarus dared not deny them. "Speak then," he snarled, turning to me, "but blaspheme not against the things that are sacred upon Barsoom." "Men of Helium," I cried, turning to the spectators and speaking over the heads of my judges, "how can John Carter expect justice from the men of Zodanga? He cannot, nor does he ask it. It is to the men of Helium that he states his case, nor does he appeal for mercy to any. It is not in his own cause that he speaks now. It is in thine, in the cause of your wives and daughters, and of wives and daughters yet unborn. It is to save them from the unthinkably atrocious indignities that I have seen heaped upon the fair women of Barsoom in the place men call the temple of Ishus. It is to save them from the sucking embrace of the plant men, from the fangs of the great white apes of Dor, from the cruel lust of the holy Therns, from all that the cold, dead Ish carries them to, from homes of love and life and happiness. Sits there no man here who does not know the history of John Carter, how he came among you from another world, and rose from a prisoner among the green men, through torture and persecution, to a high place among the highest of Barsoom. Nor ever did you know John Carter to lie in his own behalf, or to say aught that might harm the people of Barsoom, or to speak lightly of the strange religion which he respected without understanding. There be no man here or elsewhere upon Barsoom today who does not owe his life directly to a single act of mine, in which I sacrificed myself and the happiness of my princess that you might live. And so, men of Helium, I think that I have the right to demand that I be heard, that I be believed, and that you let me serve you and save you from the false hereafter of Dor and Ishus, as I saved you from the real death that other day. It is to you of Helium that I speak now. When I am done, let the men of Zodanga have their will with me. Zadars has taken my sword from me, so the men of Zodanga no longer fear me. Will you listen? Speak, John Carter, Prince of Helium, cried a great noble from the audience, and the multitude echoed his permission, until the building rocked with the noise of their demonstration. Zadars knew better than to interfere with such a sentiment as was expressed that day in the Temple of Reward, and so for 2 hours I talked with the people of Helium. But when I had finished, Zadars arose, and turning to the judges, said in a low tone, My nobles, you have heard John Carter's plea. Every opportunity has been given him to prove his innocence, if he be not guilty. But instead he has but utilized the time in further blasphemy. What, gentlemen, is your verdict? Death to the blasphemer, cried one, springing to his feet, and in an instant the entire 31 judges were on their feet, with upraised swords in token of their unanimity of their verdict. If the people did not hear Zadars' charge, they certainly did hear the verdict of the tribunal. A sullen murmur rose louder and louder about the packed Colosseum, and then Cantos Can, who had not left the platform since first he had taken his place near me, raised his hand for silence. When he could be heard, he spoke to the people in a cool and level voice. You have heard the fate that the men of Zodanga would meet to Helium's noblest hero. It may be the duty of the men of Helium to accept the verdict as final. Let each man act according to his own heart. Here is the answer of Cantos Can, head of the navy of Helium, to Zadars and his judges. And with that he unbuckled his scabbard and threw his sword at my feet. In an instant, soldiers and citizens, officers and nobles were crowding past the soldiers of Zodanga, and forcing their way to the throne of righteousness. 100 men surged upon the platform, and 100 blades rattled and clanked to the floor at my feet. Zadars and his officers were furious, but they were helpless. One by one I raised the swords to my lips and buckled them again upon their owners. Come, said Cantos Can, we will escort John Carter and his party to his own palace. And they formed about us and started toward the stairs leading to the Isle of Hope. Stop, cried Zadars. Soldiers of Helium, let no prisoner leave the throne of righteousness. The soldiery from Zodanga were the only organized body of Heliumetic troops within the temple, so Zadars was confident that his orders would be obeyed. But I do not think that he looked for the opposition that was raised the moment the soldiers advanced towards the throne. From every quarter of the Colosseum swords flashed, and men rushed threatening upon the Zodangans. Someone raised a cry. Tardos Mors is dead. 1,000 years to John Carter, Jeddick of Helium. As I heard that, and saw the ugly attitude of the men of Helium toward the soldiers of Zadars, I knew that only a miracle could avert a clash that would end in civil war. Hold, I cried, leaping to the pedestal of truth once more. Let no man move till I am done. A single sword thrust here today may plunge Helium into a bitter and bloody war, the results of which none can foresee. It will turn brother against brother and father against son. No man's life is worth that sacrifice. Rather would I submit to the biased judgment of Zadars than be the cause of civil strife in Helium. Let us each give in a point to the other, and let this entire matter rest until Tardos Mors returns, or Mors Kajak his son. If neither be back at the end of a year, a second trial may be held. The thing has a precedent. And then turning to Zadars, I said in a low voice, Unless you be a bigger fool than I take you to be, you will grasp the chance I am offering you, ere it is too late. Once that multitude of swords below is drawn against your soldiery, no man upon Barsoom, not even Tardos Mors himself, can avert the consequences. What say you? Speak quickly. The Jed of Zodangan Helium raised his voice to the angry sea beneath us. "Stay your hands, men of Helium," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "The sentence of the court is passed, but the day of retribution has not been set. I, Zadaris, Jed of Zodanga, appreciating the royal connections of the prisoner and his past services to Helium and Barsoom, grant a respite of 1 year, or until the return of Mors Kajak, or Tardos Mors to Helium. Disperse quietly to your houses. Go." No one moved. Instead, they stood in tense silence with their eyes fastened upon me, as though waiting for a signal to attack. "Clear the temple," commanded Zadaris in a low tone to one of his officers. Fearing the result of an attempt to carry out this order by force, I stepped to the edge of the platform and, pointing toward the main entrance, bid them pass out. As one man they turned at my request and filed, silent and threatening, past the soldiers of Zadaris, Jed of Zodanga, who stood scowling in impotent rage. Kantos Kan, with the others who had sworn allegiance to me, still stood upon the throne of righteousness with me. "Come," said Kantos Kan to me, "we will escort you to your palace, my prince. Come, Cathoris and Exidar. Come, Tars Tarkas." And with a haughty sneer for Zadaris upon his handsome lips, he turned and strode to the throne steps and up the Isle of Hope. We 4 and the 100 loyal ones followed behind him, nor was a hand raised to stay us, though glowering eyes followed our triumphant march through the temple. In the avenues we found a press of people, but they opened a pathway for us, and many were the swords that were flung at my feet as I passed through the city of Helium toward my palace upon the outskirts. Here my old slaves fell upon their knees and kissed my hands as I greeted them. They cared not where I had been. It was enough that I had returned to them. "Ah, master," cried one, "if our divine princess were but here, this would be a day indeed." Tears came to my eyes so that I was forced to turn away that I might hide my emotions. Carthoris wept openly as the slaves pressed about him with expressions of affection and words of sorrow for our common loss. It was now that Tars Tarkas for the first time learned that his daughter, Sola, had accompanied Dejathoris upon the last long pilgrimage. I had not had the heart to tell him what Kantos Kan had told me. With the stoicism of the Green Martian, he showed no sign of suffering, yet I knew that his grief was as poignant as mine. In marked contrast to his kind, he had in well-developed form the kindlier human characteristics of love, friendship, and charity. It was a sad and somber party that sat at the feast of welcome in the great dining hall of the palace of the Prince of Helium that day. We were over 100 strong, not counting the members of my little court, for Dejathoris and I had maintained a household consistent with our royal rank. The board, according to Red Martian custom, was triangular, for there were 3 in our family. Carthoris and I presided in the center of our sides of the table. Midway of the third side, Dejathoris's high-backed carven chair stood vacant except for her gorgeous wedding trappings and jewels which were draped upon it. Behind stood a slave, as in the days when his mistress had occupied her place at the board, ready to do her bidding. It was the way upon Barsoom, so I endured the anguish of it, though it wrung my heart to see that silent chair where it should have been my laughing and vivacious princess keeping the great hall ringing with her merry gaiety. At my right sat Kantos Kan, while to the right of Dejathoris's empty place Tars Tarkas sat in a huge chair before a raised section of the board which years ago I had had constructed to meet the requirements of his mighty bulk. The place of honor at a Martian horde is always at the hostess's right, and this place was ever reserved by Dejathoris for the great Thark upon the occasions that he was in Helium. Horvastus sat in the seat of honor upon Carthoris's side of the table. There was little general conversation. It was a quiet and saddened party. The loss of Dejathoris was still fresh in the minds of all, and to this was added fear for the safety of Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak, as well as doubt and uncertainty as to the fate of Helium, should it prove true that she was permanently deprived of her great Jeddak. Suddenly our attention was attracted by the sound of distant shouting, as of many people raising their voices at once, but whether in anger or rejoicing we could not tell. Nearer and nearer came the tumult. A slave rushed into the dining hall to cry that a great concourse of people was swarming through the palace gates. A second burst upon the heels of the first, alternately laughing and shrieking as a madman. "Dejathoris is found!" he cried. "A messenger from Dejathoris!" I waited to hear no more. The great windows of the dining hall overlooked the avenue leading to the main gates. They were upon the opposite side of the hall from me, with the table intervening. I did not waste time encircling the great board. With a single leap I cleared table and diners and sprang upon the balcony beyond. 30 feet below lay the scarlet sword of the lawn, and beyond were many people crowding about a great thoat which bore a rider headed toward the palace. I vaulted to the ground below and ran swiftly toward the advancing party. As I came near to them, I saw that the figure on the thoat was Sola. "Where's the Princess of Helium?" I cried. The green girl slid from her mighty mount and ran toward me. "Oh, my prince, she cried. "She's gone forever. Even now she may be a captive upon the lesser moon. The Black Pirates of Barsoom have stolen her." End of chapter 17.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the South Shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 18. Sola's Story. Once within the palace, I drew Sola to the dining hall, and when she had greeted her father after the formal manner of the green men, she told the story of the pilgrimage and capture of Dejah Thoris. 7 days ago, after her audience with Zadars, Dejah Thoris attempted to slip from the palace in the dead of night. Although I had not heard the outcome of her interview with Zadars, I knew that something had occurred then to cause her the keenest mental agony, and when I discovered her creeping from the palace, I did not need to be told her destination. Hastily arousing a dozen of her most faithful guards, I explained my fears to them, and as one they enlisted with me to follow our beloved princess in her wanderings, even to the sacred Ish and the Valley Dor. We came upon her but a short distance from the palace. With her was faithful Woola the hound, but none other. When we overtook her, she feigned anger, and ordered us back to the palace. But for once we disobeyed her. And when she found that we would not let her go upon the last long pilgrimage alone, she wept and embraced us, and together we went out into the night toward the south. The following day we came upon a herd of small thoats, and thereafter we were mounted and made good time. We traveled very fast and very far due south until the morning of the 5th day we sighted a great fleet of battleships sailing north. They saw us before we could seek shelter, and soon we were surrounded by a horde of black men. The princess's guard fought nobly to the end, but they were soon overcome and slain. Only Dejah Thoris and I were spared. When she realized that she was in the clutches of the black pirates, she attempted to take her own life, but one of the blacks tore her dagger from her, and then they bound us both so that we could not use our hands. The fleet continued north after capturing us. There were about 20 large battleships in all, besides a number of small swift cruisers. That evening, one of the smaller cruisers that had been far in advance of the fleet returned with a prisoner, a young red woman, whom they had picked up in a range of hills under the very noses, they said, of a fleet of 3 Red Martian battleships. From scraps of conversation which we overheard, it was evident that the black pirates were searching for a party of fugitives that had escaped them several days prior. That they considered the capture of the young woman important was evident from the long and earnest interview the commander of the fleet held with her when she was brought to him. Later she was bound and placed in the compartment with Dejah Thoris and myself. The new captive was a very beautiful girl. She told Dejah Thoris that many years ago she had taken the voluntary pilgrimage from the court of her father, the Jeddak of Parth. She was Thuvia, the princess of Parth. And then she asked Dejah Thoris who she might be. And when she heard, she fell upon her knees and kissed Dejah Thoris's fettered hands, and told her that that very morning she had been with John Carter, Prince of Helium, and Carthoris, her son. Dejah Thoris could not believe her at first. But finally, when the girl had narrated all the strange adventures that had befallen her since she had met John Carter, and told her of the things John Carter and Carthoris and Exodar had narrated of their adventures in the land of the firstborn, Dejah Thoris knew that it could be none other than the Prince of Helium. For who, she said, upon all Barsoom other than John Carter could have done the deeds you tell of? And when Thuvia told Dejah Thoris of her love for John Carter, and his loyalty and devotion to the princess of his choice, Dejah Thoris broke down and wept, cursing Zadars, and the cruel fate that had driven her from Helium but a few brief days before the return of her beloved lord. I do not blame you for loving him, Thuvia, she said, and that your affection for him is pure and sincere I can well believe from the candor of your avowal of it to me. The fleet continued north nearly to Helium. but last night they evidently realized that John Carter had indeed escaped them, and so they turned toward the south once more. Shortly thereafter a guard entered our compartment and dragged me to the deck. "There is no place in the land of the firstborn for a green one," he said, and with that he gave me a terrific shove that carried me toppling from the deck of the battleship. Evidently this seemed to him the easiest way of ridding the vessel of my presence and killing me at the same time. But a kind fate intervened, and by a miracle I escaped with but slight bruises. The ship was moving slowly at the time, and as I lunged overboard into the darkness beneath, I shuddered at the awful plunge I thought awaited me. For all day the fleet had sailed thousands of feet above the ground, but to my utter surprise I struck upon a soft mass of vegetation not 20 feet from the deck of the ship. In fact, the keel of the vessel must have been grazing the surface of the ground at the time. I lay all night where I had fallen, and the next morning brought an explanation of the fortunate coincidence that had saved me from a terrible death. As the sun rose, I saw a vast panorama of sea bottom and distant hills lying far below me. I was upon the highest peak of a lofty range. The fleet, in the darkness of the preceding night, had barely grazed the crest of the hills, and in the brief span that they hovered close to the surface the black guard had pitched me, as he supposed, to my death. A few miles west of me was a great waterway. When I reached it, I found to my delight that it belonged to Helium. Here a thoat was procured for me. The rest you know. For many minutes none spoke. Deja Thors in the clutches of the firstborn. I shuddered at the thought, but of a sudden the old fire of unconquerable self-confidence surged through me. I sprang to my feet, and with back-thrown shoulders and upraised sword took a solemn vow to reach, rescue, and revenge my princess. 100 swords leaped from 100 scabbards, and 100 fighting men sprang to the tabletop and pledged me their lives and fortunes to the expedition. Already my plans were formulated. I thanked each loyal friend, and leaving Carthoris to entertain them, withdrew to my own audience chamber with Cantos Can, Tars Tarkas, Exedar, and Horvastus. Here we discussed the details of our expedition until long after dark. Exedar was positive that Ishus would choose both Deja Thors and Thuvia to serve her for a year. "For that length of time at least they will be comparatively safe," he said, "and we will at least know where to look for them." In the matter of equipping a fleet to enter Omin, the details were left to Cantos Can and Exedar. The former agreed to take such vessels as we required into dock as rapidly as possible, where Exedar would direct their equipment with water propellers. For many years the Black had been in charge of the refitting of captured battleships that they might navigate Omin, and so was familiar with the construction of the propellers, housings, and the auxiliary gearing required. It was estimated that it would require 6 months to complete our preparations in view of the fact that the utmost secrecy must be maintained to keep the project from the ears of Zadaris. Cantos Can was confident now that the man's ambitions were fully aroused, and that nothing short of the title of Jeddak of Helium would satisfy him. "I doubt," he said, "if he would even welcome Deja Thoris's return, for it would mean another nearer the throne than he. With you and Carthoris out of the way, there would be little to prevent him from assuming the title of Jeddak, and you may rest assured that so long as he is supreme here, there is no safety for either of you." "There is a way," cried Horvastus, "to thwart him effectually and forever." "What?" I asked. He smiled. "I shall whisper it here, but some day I shall stand upon the dome of the Temple of Reward and shout it to cheering multitudes below." "What do you mean?" asked Cantos Can. "John Carter, Jeddak of Helium," said Horvastus in a low voice. The eyes of my companions lighted, and grim smiles of pleasure and anticipation overspread their faces, as each eye turned toward me questioningly. But I shook my head. "No, my friends," I said, smiling. "Thank you, but it cannot be. Not yet, at least. When we know that Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak are gone to return no more, if I be here, then I shall join you all to see that the people of Helium are permitted to choose fairly their next Jeddak. Whom they choose may count upon the loyalty of my sword, nor shall I seek the honor for myself. Until then, Tardos Mors is Jeddak of Helium, and Zadaris his representative." "As you will, John Carter," said Horvastus, "but—" "What was that?" he whispered, pointing toward the window overlooking the gardens. The words were scarce out of his mouth ere he had sprung to the balcony without. "There he goes!" he cried excitedly. "The guards! Below there! The guards!" We were close behind him, and all saw the figure of a man run quickly across a little piece of sward and disappear in the shrubbery beyond. "He was on the balcony when I first saw him," cried Horvastus. "Quick, let us follow him." Together we ran to the gardens, but even though we scoured the grounds with the entire guard for hours, no trace could we find of the night marauder. "What do you make of it, Cantos Can?" asked Tars Tarkas. "A spy sent by Zadars," he replied. "It was ever his way." "He will have something interesting to report to his masters, then," laughed Horvastus. "I hope he heard only our references to a new Jeddak," I said. "If he overheard our plans to rescue Deja Thors, it will mean civil war, for he will attempt to thwart us, and in that I will not be thwarted. There would I turn against Tardos Mors himself, were it necessary. If it throws all Helium into a bloody conflict, I shall go on with these plans to save my princess. Nothing shall stay me now, short of death. And should I die, my friends, will you take oath to prosecute the search for her and bring her back in safety to her grandfather's court?" Upon the hilt of his sword, each of them swore to do as I had asked. It was agreed that the battleships that were to be remodeled should be ordered to Hastur, another Heliumetic city, far to the southwest. Cantos Can thought that the docks there, in addition to their regular work, would accommodate at least 6 battleships at a time. As he was commander-in-chief of the navy, it would be a simple matter for him to order the vessels there as they could be handled, and thereafter keep the remodeled fleet in remote parts of the empire until we should be ready to assemble it for the dash upon Omin. It was late that night before our conference broke up, but each man there had his particular duties outlined, and the details of the entire plan had been mapped out. Cantos Can and Exodar were to attend to the remodeling of the ships. Tars Tarkas was to get into communication with Thark and learn the sentiments of his people toward his return from Dor. If favorable, he was to return immediately to Thark and devote his time to the assembling of a great horde of green warriors whom it was our plan to send in transports directly to the Valley Dor and the Temple of Ishus, while the fleet entered Omin and destroyed the vessels of the firstborn. Upon Horvastus devolved the delicate mission of organizing a secret force of fighting men sworn to follow John Carter wherever he might lead. As we estimated that it would require over 1,000,000 men to man the 1,000 great battleships we intended to use on Omin, and the transports for the green men as well as the ships that were to convoy the transports, it was no trifling job that Horvastus had before him. After they had left, I bid Carthoris good night, for I was very tired, and going to my own apartments, bathed and lay down upon my sleeping silks and furs for the first good night's sleep I had had an opportunity to look forward to since I had returned to Barsoom. But even now I was to be disappointed. How long I slept I do not know. When I awoke suddenly, it was to find a half-dozen powerful men upon me, a gag already in my mouth, and a moment later my arms and legs securely bound. So quickly had they worked, and to such good purpose, that I was utterly beyond the power to resist them by the time I was fully awake. Never a word spoke they, and the gag effectually prevented me speaking. Silently they lifted me and bore me toward the door of my chamber. As they passed the window through which the farther moon was casting its brilliant beams, I saw that each of the party had his face swathed in layers of silk. I could not recognize one of them. When they had come into the corridor with me, they turned toward a secret panel in the wall which led to the passage that terminated in the pits beneath the palace. That any knew of this panel outside my own household I was doubtful. Yet the leader of the band did not hesitate a moment. He stepped directly to the panel, touched the concealed button, and as the door swung open, he stood aside while his companions entered with me. Then he closed the panel behind him and followed us. Down through the passageways to the pits we went. The leader rapped upon it with the hilt of his sword. 3 quick, sharp blows, a pause, then 3 more, another pause, and then 2. A second later the wall swung in, and I was pushed within a brilliantly lighted chamber in which sat 3 richly trapped men. One of them turned toward me with a sardonic smile upon his thin, cruel lips. It was Zadars. End of Chapter 18.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 19. Black Despair. "Ah," said Zadaris, "to what kindly circumstance am I indebted for the pleasure of this unexpected visit from the Prince of Helium?" While he was speaking, one of my guards had removed the gag from my mouth, but I made no reply to Zadaris, simply standing there in silence with level gaze fixed upon the Jed of Zodanga, and I doubt not that my expression was colored by the contempt I felt for the man. The eyes of those within the chamber were fixed first upon me and then upon Zadaris, until finally a flush of anger crept slowly over his face. "You may go," he said to those who had brought me, and when only his 2 companions and ourselves were left in the chamber, he spoke to me again in a voice of ice, very slowly and deliberately, with many pauses, as though he would choose his words cautiously. "John Carter," he said, "by the edict of custom, by the law of our religion, and by the verdict of an impartial court, you are condemned to die. The people cannot save you. I alone may accomplish that. You are absolutely in my power to do with as I wish. I may kill you, or I may free you. And should I elect to kill you, none would be the wiser. Should you go free in Helium for a year, in accordance with the conditions of your reprieve, there is little fear that the people would ever insist upon execution of the sentence imposed upon you. You may go free within 2 minutes upon one condition. Tardos Mors will never return to Helium, neither will Mors Kajak, nor Deja Thors. Helium must select a new Jeddak within the year. Zadaris would be Jeddak of Helium. Say that you will espouse my cause. This is the price of your freedom. I am done." I knew it was within the scope of Zadaris' cruel heart to destroy me, and if I were dead I could see little reason to doubt that he might easily become Jeddak of Helium. Free, I could prosecute the search for Deja Thors. Were I dead, my brave comrades might not be able to carry out our plans. So by refusing to accede to his request, it was quite probable that not only would I not prevent him from becoming Jeddak of Helium, but that I would be the means of sealing Deja Thors' fate, of consigning her, through my refusal, to the horrors of the arena of Ishis. For a moment I was perplexed, but for a moment only. The proud daughter of 1,000 Jeddaks would choose death to a dishonorable alliance such as this, nor could John Carter do less for Helium than his princess would do. Then I turned to Zadaris. "There can be no alliance," I said, "between a traitor to Helium and a prince of the house of Tardos Mors. I do not believe, Zadaris, that the great Jeddak is dead." Zadaris shrugged his shoulders. "It will not be long, John Carter," he said, "that your opinions will be of interest even to yourself, so make the best of them while you can. Zadaris will permit you in due time to reflect further upon the magnanimous offer he has made you. Into the silence and darkness of the pits you will enter upon your reflection this night with the knowledge that should you fail within a reasonable time to agree to the alternative which has been offered you, never shall you emerge from the darkness and the silence again, nor shall you know at what minute the hand will reach out through the darkness and the silence with the keen dagger that shall rob you of your last chance to win again the warmth and the freedom and the joyousness of the outer world." Zadaris clapped his hands as he ceased speaking. The guards returned. Zadaris waved his hand in my direction. "To the pits," he said. That was all. 4 men accompanied me from the chamber, and with a radium handlight to illume the way, escorted me through seemingly interminable tunnels, down, ever down beneath the city of Helium. At length they halted within a fair-sized chamber. There were rings set in the rocky walls. To them chains were fastened, and at the ends of many of the chains were human skeletons. One of these they kicked aside, and unlocking the huge padlock that had held a chain about what had once been a human ankle, they snapped the iron band about my own leg. Then they left me, taking the light with them. Utter darkness prevailed. For a few minutes I could hear the clanking of accoutrements, but even this grew fainter and fainter until at last the silence was as complete as the darkness. I was alone with my gruesome companions, with the bones of dead men whose fate was likely but the index of my own. How long I stood listening in the darkness I do not know. but the silence was unbroken, and at last I sunk to the hard floor of my prison, where, leaning my head against the stony wall, I slept. It must have been several hours later that I awakened to find a young man standing before me. In one hand he bore a light, in the other a receptacle containing a gruel-like mixture, the common prison fare of Barsoom. "Zarar sends you greetings," said the young man, "and commands me to inform you that though he is fully advised of the plot to make you Ch18 of Helium, he is, however, not inclined to withdraw the offer which he has made you. To gain your freedom, you have but to request me to advise Zarar that you accept the terms of his proposition." I but shook my head. The youth said no more, and after placing the food upon the floor at my side, returned up the corridor, taking the light with him. Twice a day for many days this youth came to my cell with food, and ever the same greetings from Zarar. For a long time I tried to engage him in conversation upon other matters, but he would not talk, and so at length I desisted. For months I sought to devise methods to inform Thers of my whereabouts. For months I scraped and scraped upon a single link of the massive chain which held me, hoping eventually to wear it through, that I might follow the youth back through the winding tunnels to a point where I could make a break for liberty. I was beside myself with anxiety for knowledge of the progress of the expedition which was to rescue Ch18. I felt that Thers would not let the matter drop, were he free to act, but in so far as I knew, he also might be a prisoner in Zadar's pits. That Zadar's spy had overheard our conversation relative to the selection of a new Ch18, I knew, and scarcely a half-dozen minutes prior we had discussed the details of the plan to rescue Ch18. The chances were that that matter, too, was well known to him. Thers, Cantos Can, Tars Tarkas, Horvastus, and Edgar might even now be the victims of Zadar's assassins, or else his prisoners. I determined to make at least one more effort to learn something, and to this end I adopted strategy when next the youth came to my cell. I had noticed that he was a handsome fellow, about the size and age of Thers, and I had also noticed that his shabby trappings but illy comported with his dignified and noble bearing. It was with these observations as a basis that I opened my negotiations with him upon his next subsequent visit. "You have been very kind to me during my imprisonment here," I said to him, "and as I feel that I have at best but a very short time to live, I wish, ere it is too late, to furnish substantial testimony of my appreciation of all that you have done to render my imprisonment bearable. Promptly you have brought my food each day, seeing that it was pure and of sufficient quantity. Never by word or deed have you attempted to take advantage of my defenseless condition to insult or torture me. You have been uniformly courteous and considerate. It is this more than any other thing which prompts my feeling of gratitude and my desire to give you some slight token of it. In the guard-room of my palace are many fine trappings. Go thou there and select the harness which most pleases you. It shall be yours. All I ask is that you wear it, that I may know that my wish has been realized. Tell me that you will do it." The boy's eyes had lighted with pleasure as I spoke, and I saw him glance from his rusty trappings to the magnificence of my own. For a moment he stood in thought before he spoke, and for that moment my heart fairly ceased beating. So much for me there was which hung upon the substance of his answer. And I went to the palace of the Prince of Helium with any such demand, they would laugh at me, and into the bargain would more than likely throw me head foremost into the avenue. No, it cannot be, though I thank you for the offer. Why, if Zarar even dreamed that I contemplated such a thing, he would have my heart cut out of me. "There could be no harm in it, my boy," I urged. "By night you may go to my palace with a note from me to Thers, my son. You may read the note before you deliver it, that you may know that it contains nothing harmful to Zarar. My son will be discreet, and so none but us three need know. It is very simple, and such a harmless act that it could be condemned by no one." Again he stood silently in deep thought. "And there is a jeweled short sword which I took from the body of a northern Ch18. When you get the harness, see that Thers gives you that also. With it and the harness, which you may select, there will be no more handsomely accoutred warrior in all Zodanga. Bring writing materials when you come next to my cell, and within a few hours we shall see you garbed in a style befitting your birth and carriage." Still in thought, and without speaking, he turned and left me. I could not guess what his decision might be, and for hours I sat fretting over the outcome of the matter. If he accepted a message to Carthoris, it would mean to me that Carthoris still lived and was free. If the youth returned wearing the harness and the sword, I would know that Carthoris had received my note, and that he knew that I still lived. That the bearer of the note was a Zodangan would be sufficient to explain to Carthoris that I was a prisoner of Zadaris. It was with feelings of excited expectancy, which I could scarce hide, that I heard the youth's approach upon the occasion of his next regular visit. I did not speak beyond my accustomed greeting of him. As he placed the food upon the floor by my side, he also deposited writing materials at the same time. My heart fairly bounded for joy. I had won my point. For a moment I looked at the materials in feigned surprise, but soon I permitted an expression of dawning comprehension to come into my face, and then, picking them up, I penned a brief order to Carthoris to deliver to Parthak a harness of his selection and the short sword which I described. That was all, but it meant everything to me and to Carthoris. I laid the note open upon the floor. Parthak picked it up, and without a word left me. As nearly as I could estimate, I had at this time been in the pits for 300 days. If anything was to be done to save Dejathoris, it must be done quickly, for, were she not already dead, her end must soon come, since those whom Ishus chose lived but a single year. The next time I heard approaching footsteps, I could scarce await to see if Parthak wore the harness and the sword. But judge, if you can, my chagrin and disappointment when I saw that he who bore my food was not Parthak. "What has become of Parthak?" I asked. But the fellow would not answer, and as soon as he had deposited my food, turned and retraced his steps to the world above. Days came and went, and still my new jailer continued his duties, nor would he ever speak a word to me, either in reply to the simplest question or of his own initiative. I could only speculate on the cause of Parthak's removal, but that it was connected in some way directly with the note I had given him was most apparent to me. After all my rejoicing, I was no better off than before, for now I did not even know that Carthoris lived, for if Parthak had wished to raise himself in the estimation of Zadaris, he would have permitted me to go on precisely as I did, so that he could carry my note to his master, in proof of his own loyalty and devotion. 30 days had passed since I had given the youth the note. 330 days had passed since my incarceration. As closely as I could figure, there remained a bare 30 days ere Dejathoris would be ordered to the arena for the rites of Ishus. As the terrible picture forced itself vividly across my imagination, I buried my face in my arms, and only with the greatest difficulty was it that I repressed the tears that welled to my eyes despite my every effort. To think of that beautiful creature torn and rended by the cruel fangs of the hideous white apes, it was unthinkable. Such a horrid fact could not be, and yet my reason told me that within 30 days my incomparable princess would be fought over in the arena of the firstborn by those very wild beasts, that her bleeding corpse would be dragged through the dirt and the dust, until at last a part of it would be rescued to be served as food upon the tables of the black nobles. I think that I should have gone crazy but for the sound of my approaching jailer. It distracted my attention from the terrible thoughts that had been occupying my entire mind. Now a new and grim determination came to me. I would make one superhuman effort to escape, kill my jailer by a ruse, and trust to fate to lead me to the outer world in safety. With the thought came instant action. I threw myself upon the floor of my cell close by the wall, in a strained and distorted posture, as though I were dead after a struggle or convulsions. When he should stoop over me, I had but to grasp his throat with one hand and strike him a terrific blow with the slack of my chain, which I gripped firmly in my right hand for the purpose. Nearer and nearer came the doomed man. Now I heard him halt before me. There was a muttered exclamation, and then a step as he came to my side. I felt him kneel beside me. My grip tightened upon the chain. He leaned close to me. I must open my eyes to find his throat, grasp it, and strike one mighty final blow, all at the same instant. The thing worked just as I had planned. So brief was the interval between the opening of my eyes and the fall of the chain that I could not check it, though in that minute interval I recognized the face so close to mine as that of my son, Carthoris. God, what cruel and malign fate had worked to such a frightful end! What devious chain of circumstances had led my boy to my side at this one particular minute of our lives, when I could strike him down and kill him, in ignorance of his identity? A benign though tardy providence blurred my vision and my mind as I sank into unconsciousness across the lifeless body of my only son. When I regained consciousness, it was to feel a cool, firm hand pressed upon my forehead. For an instant I did not open my eyes. I was endeavoring to gather the loose ends of many thoughts and memories which flitted elusively through my tired and overwrought brain. At length came the cruel recollection of the thing that I had done in my last conscious act, and then I dared not to open my eyes for fear of what I should see lying beside me. I wondered who it could be who ministered to me. Carthoris must have had a companion whom I had not seen. Well, I must face the inevitable sometime, so why not now? And with a sigh I opened my eyes. Leaning over me was Carthoris, a great bruise upon his forehead where the chain had struck, but alive. Thank God, alive. There was no one with him. Reaching out my arms, I took my boy within them, and if ever there arose from any planet a fervent prayer of gratitude, it was there beneath the crust of dying Mars, as I thanked the eternal mystery for my son's life. The brief instant in which I had seen and recognized Carthoris before the chain fell must have been ample to check the force of the blow. He told me that he had lain unconscious for a time. How long he did not know. "How came you here at all?" I asked, mystified that he had found me without a guide. "It was by your wit in appraising me of your existence and imprisonment through the youth Parthak. Until he came for his harness and his sword, we had thought you dead. When I had read your note, I did as you had bid, giving Parthak his choice of the harness in the guardroom, and later bringing the jeweled short sword to him. But the minute that I had fulfilled the promise you evidently had made him, my obligation to him ceased. Then I commenced to question him, but he would give me no information as to your whereabouts. He was intensely loyal to Zadaris. Finally, I gave him a fair choice between freedom and the pits beneath the palace. The price of freedom to be full information as to where you were imprisoned and directions which would lead us to you. But still he maintained his stubborn partisanship. Despairing, I had him removed to the pits, where he still is. No threats of torture or death, no bribes, however fabulous, would move him. His only reply to all our importunities was that whenever Parthak died, were it tomorrow or 1,000 years hence, no man could truly say a traitor is gone to his deserts. Finally, Exedar, who is a fiend of subtle craftiness, evolved a plan whereby we might worm the information from him. And so I caused Horvastus to be harnessed in the metal of a Zodangan soldier, and chained in Parthak's cell beside him. For 15 days the noble Horvastus has languished in the darkness of the pits, but not in vain. Little by little he won the confidence and friendship of the Zodangan, until only today Parthak, thinking that he was speaking not only to a countryman, but to a dear friend, revealed to Horvastus the exact cell in which you lay. It took me but a short time to locate the plans of the pits of Helium among thy official papers. To come to you, though, was a trifle more difficult matter. As you know, while all the pits beneath the city are connected, there are but single entrances from those beneath each section and its neighbor, and that at the upper level just underneath the ground. Of course, these openings, which lead from contiguous pits to those beneath government buildings, are always guarded, and so, while I easily came to the entrance to the pits beneath the palace which Zadaris is occupying, I found there a Zodangan soldier on guard. There I left him when I had gone by, but his soul was no longer with him. And here I am, just in time to be nearly killed by you, he ended, laughing. As he talked, Carthoris had been working at the lock, which held my fetters, and now, with an exclamation of pleasure, he dropped the end of the chain to the floor, and I stood up once more, freed from the galling irons I had chafed in for almost a year. He had brought a long sword and a dagger for me, and thus armed we set out upon the return journey to my palace. At the point where we left the pits of Zadaris, we found the body of the guard Carthoris had slain. It had not yet been discovered, and, in order to still further delay search and mystify the Jed's people, we carried the body with us for a short distance, hiding it in a tiny cell off the main corridor of the pits beneath an adjoining estate. Some half-hour later we came to the pits beneath our own palace, and soon thereafter emerged into the audience chamber itself, where we found Cantos Can, Tars Tarkas, Horvastus, and Exedar awaiting us most impatiently. No time was lost in fruitless recounting of my imprisonment. What I desired to know was how well the plans we had laid nearly a year ago had been carried out. "It has taken much longer than we had expected," replied Cantos Can. "The fact that we were compelled to maintain utter secrecy has handicapped us terribly. Zadaris' spies are everywhere. Yet to the best of my knowledge no word of our real plans has reached the villain's ear. Tonight there lies about the great docks at Hastur a fleet of 1,000 of the mightiest battleships that ever sailed above Barsoom, and each equipped to navigate the air of Omin and the waters of Omin itself. Upon each battleship there are 5 10-man cruisers, and 10 5-man scouts, and 100 one-man scouts. In all, 116,000 craft fitted with both air and water propellers. At Thark lie the transport for the green warriors of Tars Tarkas, 900 large troop ships, and with them their convoys. 7 days ago all was in readiness, but we waited in the hope that by so doing your rescue might be encompassed in time for you to command the expedition. It is well we waited, my prince. How is it, Tars Tarkas, I asked, that the men of Thark take not the accustomed action against one who returns from the bosom of Ish? They sent a council of 50 chieftains to talk with me here, replied the Thark. We are a just people, and when I had told them the entire story, they were as one man in agreeing that their action toward me would be guided by the action of Helium toward John Carter. In the meantime, at their request, I was to resume my throne as Jeddak of Thark, that I might negotiate with neighboring hordes of warriors to compose the land forces of the expedition. I have done that which I agreed. 250,000 fighting men, gathered from the ice cap at the north to the ice cap at the south, and representing 1,000 different communities from 100 wild and warlike hordes, fill the great city of Thark tonight. They are ready to sail for the land of the firstborn when I give the word, and fight there until I bid them stop. All they ask is the loot they take and transportation to their own territories when the fighting and the looting are over. I am done. And thou, Horvastus, I asked, what has been thy success? 1,000,000 veteran fighting men from Helium's thin waterways man the battleships, the transports, and the convoys, he replied. Each is sworn to loyalty and secrecy, nor were enough recruited from a single district to cause suspicion. Good, I cried. Each has done his duty, and now, Cantos Can, may we not repair at once to Hastur, and get under way before tomorrow's sun? We should lose no time, Prince, replied Cantos Can. Already the people of Hastur are questioning the purpose of so great a fleet fully manned with fighting men. I wonder much that word of it has not before reached Zadaris. A cruiser awaits above at your own dock. Let us leave it. A fusillade of shots from the palace gardens just without cut short his further words. Together we rushed to the balcony in time to see a dozen members of my palace guard disappear in the shadows of some distant shrubbery as in pursuit of one who fled. Directly beneath us upon the scarlet sward a handful of guardsmen were stooping above a still and prostrate form. While we watched, they lifted the figure in their arms, and at my command bore it to the audience chamber where we had been in council. When they stretched the body at our feet, we saw that it was that of a red man in the prime of life. His metal was plain, such as common soldiers wear, or those who wish to conceal their identity. Another of Zadaris' spies, said Horvastus. So it would seem, I replied, and then to the guard, you may remove the body. Wait, said Exodar. If you will, Prince, ask that a cloth and a little thoat oil be brought. I nodded to one of the soldiers who left the chamber, returning presently with the things that Exodar had requested. The black kneeled beside the body, and dipping a corner of the cloth in the thoat oil, rubbed for a moment on the dead face before him. Then he turned to me with a smile, pointing to his work. I looked and saw that where Exodar had applied the thoat oil, the face was white as mine. And then Exodar seized the black hair of the corpse, and with a sudden wrench tore it all away, revealing a hairless pate beneath. Guardsmen and nobles pressed close about the silent witness upon the marble floor. Many were the exclamations of astonishment and questioning wonder as Exodar's axe confirmed the suspicions which he had held. A Thern, whispered Tars Tarkas. Worse than that, I fear, replied Exodar. But let us see. With that he drew his dagger and cut open a locked pouch which had dangled from the Thern's harness, and from it he brought forth a circlet of gold set with a large gem. It was the mate to that which I had taken from Sator Throg. He was a holy Thern, said Exodar. Fortunate indeed it is for us that he did not escape. The officer of the guard entered the chamber at this juncture. My prince, he said, I have to report that this fellow's companion escaped us. I think that it was with the connivance of one or more of the men at the gate. I have ordered them all under arrest. Exodar handed him the thoat oil and cloth. With this you may discover the spy among you, he said. I at once ordered a secret search within the city, for every Martian noble maintains a secret service of his own. A half-hour later, the officer of the guard came again to report. This time it was to confirm our worst fears. Half the guards at the gate that night had been Therns disguised as red men. "Come," I cried, "we must lose no time. On to Hastur at once. Should the Therns attempt to check us at the southern verge of the ice cap, it may result in the wrecking of all our plans and the total destruction of the expedition." 10 minutes later we were speeding through the night toward Hastur, prepared to strike the first blow for the preservation of Ch18. End of Chapter 19.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 20. The Air Battle. 2 hours after leaving my palace at Helium, or about midnight, Ch18, Edgar, and I arrived at Hastur. Cathors, Tars Tarkas, and Horvastus had gone directly to Thark upon another cruiser. The transports were to get underway immediately and move slowly south. The fleet of battleships would overtake them on the morning of the second day. At Hastur we found all in readiness, and so perfectly had Ch18 planned every detail of the campaign that within 10 minutes of our arrival the first of the fleet had soared aloft from its dock, and thereafter, at the rate of 1 a second, the great ships floated gracefully out into the night to form a long, thin line which stretched for miles toward the south. It was not until after we had entered the cabin of Ch18 that I thought to ask the date, for up to now I was not positive how long I had lain in the pits of Zadaris. When Ch18 told me, I realized with a pang of dismay that I had misreckoned the time while I lay in the utter darkness of my cell. 365 days had passed. It was too late to save Ch18. The expedition was no longer one of rescue but of revenge. I did not remind Ch18 of the terrible fact that ere we could hope to enter the temple of Isis, the princess of Helium would be no more. In so far as I knew, she might be already dead, for I did not know the exact date on which she first viewed Isis. What now the value of burdening my friends with my added personal sorrows? They had shared quite enough of them with me in the past. Hereafter I would keep my grief to myself, and so I said nothing to any other of the fact that we were too late. The expedition could yet do much if it could but teach the people of Barsoom the facts of the cruel deception that had been worked upon them for countless ages, and thus save thousands each year from the horrid fate that awaited them at the conclusion of the voluntary pilgrimage. If it could open to the red man the fair Valley Dor, it would have accomplished much, and in the land of lost souls between the mountains of Orts and the ice barrier were many broad acres that needed no irrigation to bear rich harvests. Here at the bottom of a dying world was the only naturally productive area upon its surface. Here alone were dews and rains. Here alone was an open sea. Here was water in plenty, and all this was but the stomping ground of fierce brutes, and from its beauteous and fertile expanse the wicked remnants of two once mighty races barred all the other millions of Barsoom. Could I but succeed in once breaking down the barrier of religious superstition which had kept the red races from this El Dorado, it would be a fitting memorial to the immortal virtues of my princess. I should have again served Barsoom, and Ch18's martyrdom would not have been in vain. On the morning of the second day we raised the great fleet of transports and their consorts at the first flood of dawn, and soon were near enough to exchange signals. I may mention here that radio aerograms are seldom if ever used in wartime, or for the transmission of secret dispatches at any time, for as often as one nation discovers a new cipher or invents a new instrument for wireless purposes, its neighbors bend every effort until they are able to intercept and translate the message. For so long a time has this gone on that practically every possibility of wireless communication has been exhausted, and no nation dares transmit dispatches of importance in this way. Tars Tarkas reported all well with the transports. The battleships passed through to take an advanced position, and the combined fleets moved slowly over the ice cap, hugging the surface closely to prevent detection by the Therns, whose land we were approaching. Far in advance of all, a thin line of one-man air scouts protected us from surprise, and on either side they flanked us, while a smaller number brought up the rear some 20 miles behind the transports. In this formation we had progressed toward the entrance to Omin for several hours, when one of our scouts returned from the front to report that a cone-like summit of the entrance was in sight. At almost the same instant, another scout from the left flank came racing toward the flagship. His very speed bespoke the importance of his information. Ch18 and I awaited him upon the little forward deck which corresponds with the bridge of earthly battleships. Scarcely had his tiny flier come to rest upon the broad landing deck of the flagship ere he was bounding up the stairway to the deck where we stood. "A great fleet of battleships south-southeast, my prince," he cried. "There must be several thousands, and they are bearing down directly upon us." "The Thern spies were not in the palace of John Carter for nothing," said Ch18 to me. "Your orders, prince." "Dispatch 10 battleships to guard the entrance to Omin, with orders to let no hostile enter or leave the shaft. That will bottle up the great fleet of the firstborn. Form the balance of the battleships into a great V with the apex pointing directly south-southeast. Order the transports, surrounded by their convoys, to follow closely in the wake of the battleships, until the point of the V has entered the enemy's line. Then the V must open outward at the apex. The battleships of each leg engage the enemy fiercely and drive him back to form a lane through his line, into which the transports with their convoys must race at top speed, that they may gain a position above the temples and gardens of the Therns. Here let them land and teach the holy Therns such a lesson in ferocious warfare as they will not forget for countless ages. It had not been my intention to be distracted from the main issue of the campaign, but we must settle this attack with the Therns once and for all, or there will be no peace for us while our fleet remains near Dor, and our chances of ever returning to the outer world will be greatly minimized." Ch18 saluted and turned to deliver my instructions to his waiting aides. In an incredibly short space of time, the formation of the battleships changed in accordance with my commands. The 10 that were to guard the way to Omin were speeding toward their destination, and the troop ships and convoys were closing up in preparation for the spurt through the lane. The order "full speed ahead" was given. The fleet sprang through the air like coursing greyhounds, and in another moment the ships of the enemy were in full view. They formed a ragged line as far as the eye could reach in either direction, and about 3 ships deep. So sudden was our onslaught that they had no time to prepare for it. It was as unexpected as lightning from a clear sky. Every phase of my plan worked splendidly. Our huge ships mowed their way entirely through the line of Thern battlecraft. Then the V opened up, and a broad lane appeared through which the transports leaped toward the temples of the Therns, which could now be plainly seen glistening in the sunlight. By the time the Therns had rallied from the attack, 100,000 green warriors were already pouring through their courts and gardens, while 150,000 others leaned from low-swinging transports to direct their almost uncanny marksmanship upon the Thern soldiery that manned the ramparts, or attempted to defend the temples. Now the 2 great fleets closed in a titanic struggle far above the fiendish din of battle in the gorgeous gardens of the Therns. Slowly the 2 lines of Helium's battleships joined their ends, and then commenced the circling within the line of the enemy, which is so marked a characteristic of Barsoomian naval warfare. Around and around in each other's tracks moved the ships under Ch18, until at length they formed nearly a perfect circle. By this time they were moving at high speed, so that they presented a difficult target for the enemy. Broadside after broadside they delivered as each vessel came in line with the ships of the Therns. The latter attempted to rush in and break up the formation, but it was like stopping a buzzsaw with the bare hand. From my position on the deck beside Ch18, I saw ship after ship of the enemy take the awful sickening dive which proclaims its total destruction. Slowly we maneuvered our circle of death until we hung above the gardens where our green warriors were engaged. The order was passed down for them to embark. Then they rose slowly to a position within the center of the circle. In the meantime the Therns' fire had practically ceased. They had had enough of us, and were only too glad to let us go on our way in peace. But our escape was not to be encompassed with such ease, for scarcely had we gotten under way Once more, in the direction of the entrance to Omin, then we saw far to the north a great black line topping the horizon. It could be nothing other than a fleet of war. Whose or whither bound we could not even conjecture. When they had come close enough to make us out at all, Ch18's operator received a radio aerogram, which he immediately handed to my companion. He read the thing and handed it to me. Ch18, it read, surrender in the name of the Ch18 of Helium, for you cannot escape, and it was signed Zadaris. The Therns must have caught and translated the message almost as soon as did we, for they immediately renewed hostilities when they realized that we were soon to be set upon by other enemies. Before Zadaris had approached near enough to fire a shot, we were again hotly engaged with the Thern fleet, and as soon as he drew near, he too commenced to pour a terrific fusillade of heavy shot into us. Ship after ship reeled and staggered into uselessness beneath the pitiless fire that we were undergoing. The thing could not last much longer. I ordered the transports to descend again into the gardens of the Therns. Wreak your vengeance to the utmost, was my message to the Green Allies, for by night there will be none left to avenge your wrongs. Presently I saw the 10 battleships that had been ordered to hold the shaft of Omin. They were returning at full speed, firing their stern batteries almost continuously. There could be but one explanation. They were being pursued by another hostile fleet. Well, the situation could be no worse. The expedition already was doomed. No man that had embarked upon it would return across that dreary ice cap. How I wished that I might face Zadaris with my longsword for just an instant before I died. It was he who had caused our failure. As I watched the oncoming 10, I saw their pursuers race swiftly into sight. It was another great fleet. For a moment I could not believe my eyes, but finally I was forced to admit that the most fatal calamity had overtaken the expedition. For the fleet I saw was none other than the fleet of the firstborn, that should have been safely bottled up in Omin. What a series of misfortunes and disasters! What awful fate hovered over me, that I should have been so terribly thwarted at every angle of my search for my lost love. Could it be possible that the curse of Ishus was upon me, that there was, indeed, some malign divinity in that hideous carcass? I would not believe it, and throwing back my shoulders, I ran to the deck below to join my men in repelling boarders from one of the Thern craft that had grappled us broadside. In the wild lust of hand-to-hand combat, my old dauntless hopefulness returned, and as Thern after Thern went down beneath my blade, I could almost feel that we should win success in the end, even from apparent failure. My presence among the men so greatly inspirited them that they fell upon the luckless whites with such terrible ferocity that within a few moments we had turned the tables upon them, and a second later, as we swarmed their own decks, I had the satisfaction of seeing their commander take the long leap from the bows of his vessel in token of surrender and defeat. Then I joined Ch18. He had been watching what had taken place on the deck below, and it seemed to have given him a new thought. Immediately he passed an order to one of his officers, and presently the colors of the Prince of Helium broke from every point of the flagship. A great cheer arose from the men of our own ship, a cheer that was taken up by every other vessel of our expedition, as they in turn broke my colors from their upper works. Then Ch18 sprang his coup. A signal legible to every sailor of all the fleets engaged in that fierce struggle was strung aloft upon the flagship. Men of Helium, for the Prince of Helium against all his enemies, it read. Presently my colors broke from one of Zadaris' ships, then from another, and another. On some we could see fierce battles waging between the Zodangan soldiery and the Heliumetic crews, but eventually the colors of the Prince of Helium floated above every ship that had followed Zadaris upon our trail. Only his flagship flew them not. Zadaris had brought 5,000 ships. The sky was black with the 3 enormous fleets. It was Helium against the field now, and the fight had settled to countless individual duels. There could be little or no maneuvering of fleets in that crowded, fire-split sky. Zadaris' flagship was close to my own. I could see the thin features of the man from where I stood. His Zodangan crew was pouring broadside after broadside into us, and we were returning their fire with equal ferocity. Closer and closer came the two vessels until but a few yards intervened. Grapplers and boarders lined the contiguous rails of each. We were preparing for the death struggle with our hated enemy. There was but a yard between the two mighty ships as the first grappling irons were hurled. I rushed to the deck to be with my men as they boarded. Just as the vessels came together with a slight shock, I forced my way through the lines and was the first to spring to the deck of Zadars' ship. After me poured a yelling, cheering, cursing throng of Helium's best fighting men. Nothing could withstand them in the fever of battle lust which enthralled them. Down went the Zodangans before that surging tide of war, and as my men cleared the lower decks, I sprang to the forward deck where stood Zadars. "You are my prisoner, Zadars," I cried. "Yield, and you shall have quarter." For a moment I could not tell whether he contemplated acceding to my demand or facing me with drawn sword. For an instant he stood hesitating, and then throwing down his arms, he turned and rushed to the opposite side of the deck. Before I could overtake him, he had sprung to the rail and hurled himself head foremost into the awful depths below. And thus came Zadars, Jed of Zodanga, to his end. On and on went that strange battle. The Therns and Blacks had not combined against us. Wherever Thern ship met ship of the firstborn was a battle royale, and in this I thought I saw our salvation. Wherever messages could be passed between us that could not be intercepted by our enemies, I passed the word that all our vessels were to withdraw from the fight as rapidly as possible, taking a position to the west and south of the combatants. I also sent an air scout to the fighting green men in the gardens below to re-embark to the transports and to join us. My commanders were further instructed then, when engaged with an enemy, to draw him as rapidly as possible toward a ship of his hereditary foemen, and by careful maneuvering to force the two to engage, thus leaving himself free to withdraw. This stratagem worked to perfection, and just before the sun went down I had the satisfaction of seeing all that was left of my once mighty fleet gathered nearly 20 miles southwest of the still terrific battle between the blacks and whites. I now transferred Exodar to another battleship and sent him with all the transports and 5,000 battleships directly overhead to the temple of Ishus. Carthoris and I, with Cantos Can, took the remaining ships and headed for the entrance to Omin. Our plan now was to attempt to make a combined assault upon Ishus at dawn of the following day. Tars Tarkas with his green warriors and Horvastus with the red men, guided by Exodar, were to land within the garden of Ishus or the surrounding plains, while Carthoris, Cantos Can, and I were to lead our smaller force from the Sea of Omin through the pits beneath the temple, which Carthoris knew so well. I now learned for the first time the cause of my 10 ships' retreat from the mouth of the shaft. It seemed that when they had come upon the shaft, the navy of the firstborn were already issuing from its mouth. Fully 20 vessels had emerged, and though they gave battle immediately in an effort to stem the tide that rolled from the black pit, the odds against them were too great, and they were forced to flee. With great caution we approached the shaft, under cover of darkness. At a distance of several miles I caused the fleet to be halted, and from there Carthoris went ahead alone upon a one-man flyer to reconnoitre. In perhaps half an hour he returned to report that there was no sign of a patrol boat or of the enemy in any form, and so we moved swiftly and noiselessly forward once more toward Omin. At the mouth of the shaft we stopped again for a moment for all the vessels to reach their previously appointed stations. Then with the flagship I dropped quickly into the black depths, while one by one the other vessels followed me in quick succession. We had decided to stake all on the chance that we would be able to reach the temple by the subterranean way, and so we left no guard of vessels at the shaft's mouth. Nor would it have profited us any to have done so, for we did not have sufficient force all told to have withstood the vast navy of the firstborn had they returned to engage us. For the safety of our entrance upon Omin we depended largely upon the very boldness of it, believing that it would be some little time before the firstborn on guard there would realize that it was an enemy and not their own returning fleet that was entering the vault of the buried sea. And such proved to be the case. In fact, 400 of my fleet of 500 rested safely upon the bosom of Omin before the first shot was fired. The battle was short and hot, but there could have been but one outcome, for the firstborn, in the carelessness of fancied security, had left but a handful of ancient and obsolete hulks to guard their mighty harbor. It was at Carthoris' suggestion that we landed our prisoners under guard upon a couple of the larger islands, and then towed the ships of the firstborn to the shaft, where we managed to wedge a number of them securely in the interior of the great well. Then we turned on the buoyancy rays in the balance of them, and let them rise by themselves to further block the passage to Omine as they came into contact with the vessels already lodged there. We now felt that it would be some time at least before the returning firstborn could reach the surface of Omine, and that we would have ample opportunity to make for the subterranean passages which lead to Ischus. One of the first steps I took was to hasten personally with a good-sized force to the island of the submarine, which I took without resistance on the part of the small guard there. I found the submarine in its pool, and at once placed a strong guard upon it and the island, where I remained to wait the coming of Carthoris and the others. Among the prisoners was Yerstead, commander of the submarine. He recognized me from the 3 trips that I had taken with him during my captivity among the firstborn. "How does it seem," I asked him, "to have the tables turned, to be prisoner of your erstwhile captive?" He smiled a very grim smile, pregnant with hidden meaning. "It will not be for long, John Carter," he replied. "We have been expecting you, and we are prepared." "So it would appear," I answered, "for you were all ready to become my prisoners with scarce a blow struck on either side." "The fleet must have missed you," he said, "but it will return to Omine, and then that will be a very different matter for John Carter." "I do not know that the fleet has missed me as yet," I said, but of course he did not grasp my meaning, and only looked puzzled. "Many prisoners travel to Ischus in your grim craft, Yerstead?" I asked. "Very many," he assented. "Might you remember one whom men called Dejathoris? Well, indeed, for her great beauty, and then, too, for the fact that she was wife to the first mortal that ever escaped from Ischus through all the countless ages of her godhood, and the way that Ischus remembers her best as the wife of one and the mother of another who raised their hands against the goddess of life eternal." I shuddered for fear of the cowardly revenge that I knew Ischus might have taken upon the innocent Dejathoris for the sacrilege of her son and her husband. "And where is Dejathoris now?" I asked, knowing that he would say the words I most dreaded. But yet I loved her so that I could not refrain from hearing even the worst about her fate, so that it fell from the lips of one who had seen her but recently. It was to me as though it brought her closer to me. "Yesterday the monthly rites of Ischus were held," replied Yerstead, "and I saw her then sitting in her accustomed place at the foot of Ischus." "What?" I cried. "She is not dead, then?" "Why, no," replied the black. "It has been no year since she gazed upon the divine glory of the radiant face of—" "No year?" I interrupted. "Why, no," insisted Yerstead. "It could not have been upward of 370 or 80 days." A great light burst upon me. How stupid I had been! I could scarcely retain an outward exhibition of my great joy. Why had I forgotten the great difference in the length of Martian and earthly years? The 10 earth years I had spent upon Barsoom had encompassed but 5 years and 96 days of Martian time, whose days are 41 minutes longer than ours, and whose years number 687 days. "I'm in time! I'm in time!" The words surged through my brain again and again, until at last I must have voiced them audibly, for Yerstead shook his head. "In time to save your princess?" he asked, and then, without waiting for my reply, "No, John Carter, Ischus will not give up her own. She knows that you are coming, and ere ever a vandal foot is set within the precincts of the temple of Ischus, if such a calamity should befall, Dejathoris will be put away forever from the last faint hope of rescue." "You mean that she will be killed merely to thwart me?" I asked. "Not that, other than as a last resort," he replied. "Hast ever heard of the Temple of the Sun? It is there that they will put her. It lies far within the inner court of the Temple of Ischus, a little temple that rises a thin spire far above the spires and minarets of the great temple that surrounds it. Beneath it, in the ground, there lies the main body of the temple, consisting in 687 circular chambers, one below another. To each chamber a single corridor leads through solid rock from the pits of Ischus. As the entire Temple of the Sun revolves once with each revolution of Barsoom about the Sun, but once each year does the entrance to each separate chamber come opposite the mouth of the corridor which forms its only link to the world without. Here Ischus puts those who displease her, but whom she does not care to execute forthwith. Or to punish a noble of the firstborn, she may cause him to be placed within a chamber of the Temple of the Sun for a year. Ofttimes she imprisons an executioner with the condemned, that death may come in a certain horrible form upon a given day, Or again, but enough food is deposited in the chamber to sustain life but the number of days that Ishus has allotted for mental anguish. Thus will Dejathoris die, and her fate will be sealed by the first alien foot that crosses the threshold of Ishus. So I was to be thwarted in the end. Although I had performed the miraculous and come within a few short moments of my divine princess, yet was I as far from her as when I stood upon the banks of the Hudson, 48 million miles away. End of Chapter 20.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 21. Through Flood and Flame. Yersted's information convinced me that there was no time to be lost. I must reach the temple of Ishus secretly before the forces under Tars Tarkas assaulted at dawn. Once within its hated walls, I was positive that I could overcome the guards of Ishus and bear away my princess, for at my back I would have a force ample for the occasion. No sooner had Carthoris and the others joined me than we commenced the transportation of our men through the submerged passage to the mouth of the gangways, which lead from the submarine pool at the temple end of the watery tunnel to the pits of Ishus. Many trips were required, but at last all stood safely together again at the beginning of the end of our quest. 5,000 strong we were, all seasoned fighting men of the most warlike race of the Red Men of Barsoom. As Carthoris alone knew the hidden ways of the tunnels, we could not divide the party and attack the temple at several points at once, as would have been most desirable, and so it was decided that he would lead us all as quickly as possible to a point near the temple's center. As we were about to leave the pool and enter the corridor, an officer called my attention to the waters upon which the submarine floated. At first they seemed to be merely agitated, as from the movement of some great body beneath the surface, and I at once conjectured that another submarine was rising to the surface in pursuit of us. But presently it became apparent that the level of the waters was rising, not with extreme rapidity, but very surely, and that soon they would overflow the sides of the pool and submerge the floor of the chamber. For a moment I did not fully grasp the terrible import of the slowly rising water. It was Carthoris who realized the full meaning of the thing, its cause and the reason for it. "Haste!" he cried. "If we delay, we all are lost. The pumps of Omine have been stopped. They would drown us like rats in a trap. We must reach the upper levels of the pits in advance of the flood, or we shall never reach them. Come!" "Lead the way, Carthoris," I cried. "We will follow." At my command the youth leaped into one of the corridors, and in column of twos the soldiers followed him in good order, each company entering the corridor only at the command of its dwar, or captain. Before the last company filed from the chamber the water was ankle deep, and that the men were nervous was quite evident. Entirely unaccustomed to water except in quantities sufficient for drinking and bathing purposes, the Red Martians instinctively shrank from it in such formidable depths and menacing activity. That they were undaunted while it swirled and eddied about their ankles spoke well for their bravery and their discipline. I was the last to leave the chamber of the submarine, and as I followed the rear of the column toward the corridor, I moved through water to my knees. The corridor, too, was flooded to the same depth, for its floor was on a level with the floor of the chamber from which it led, nor was there any perceptible rise for many yards. The march of the troops through the corridor was as rapid as was consistent with the number of men that moved through so narrow a passage, but it was not ample to permit us to gain appreciably on the pursuing tide. As the level of the passage rose, so too did the waters rise until it soon became apparent to me, who brought up the rear, that they were gaining rapidly upon us. I could understand the reason for this, as with the narrowing expanse of Omine as the waters rode towards the apex of its dome, the rapidity of its rise would increase in inverse ratio to the ever-lessening space to be filled. Long ere the last of the column could hope to reach the upper pits which lie above the danger point, I was convinced that the waters would surge after us in overwhelming volume, and that fully half the expedition would be snuffed out. As I cast about for some means of saving as many as possible of the doomed men, I saw a diverging corridor which seemed to rise at a steep angle at my right. The waters were now swirling about my waist. The men directly before me were quickly becoming panic-stricken. Something must be done at once, or they would rush forward upon their fellows in a mad stampede that would result in trampling down hundreds beneath the flood, and eventually clogging the passage beyond any hope of retreat for those in advance. Raising my voice to its utmost, I shouted my command to the dwarves ahead of me. "Call back the last 25 U-10s, I shouted. "Here seems a way of escape. Turn back and follow me." My orders were obeyed by nearer 30 U-10s, so that some 3,000 men came about and hastened into the teeth of the flood to reach the corridor up which I directed them. As the first dwarf passed in with his U-10, I cautioned him to listen closely for my commands, and under no circumstances to venture into the open or leave the pits for the temple proper until I should have come up with him, or you know that I died before I could reach you. The officer saluted and left me. The men filed rapidly past me and entered the diverging corridor which I hoped would lead to safety. The water rose breast high. Men stumbled, floundered, and went down. Many I grasped and set upon their feet again, but alone the work was greater than I could cope with. Soldiers were being swept beneath the boiling torrent, never to rise. At length the dwarf of the 10th U-10 took a stand beside me. He was a valorous soldier, Gertus by name, and together we kept the now thoroughly frightened troops in the semblance of order, and rescued many that would have drowned otherwise. Dejor Cantos, son of Cantos Can, and a padwar of the 5th U-10, joined us when his U-10 reached the opening through which the men were fleeing. Thereafter not a man was lost of all the hundreds that remained to pass from the main corridor to the branch. As the last U-10 was filing past us, the waters had risen until they surged about our necks, but we clasped hands and stood our ground until the last men had passed to the comparative safety of the new passageway. Here we found an immediate and steep ascent, so that within 100 yards we had reached a point above the waters. For a few minutes we continued rapidly up the steep grade, which I hoped would soon bring us quickly to the upper pits that led into the temple of Ishus, but I was to meet with a cruel disappointment. Suddenly I heard a cry of "Fire!" far ahead, followed almost at once by cries of terror and the loud commands of dwarves and padwars, who were evidently attempting to direct their men away from some grave danger. At last the report came back to us. "They have fired the pits ahead. We are hemmed in by flames in front and flood behind. Help, John Carter, we are suffocating." And then there swept back upon us at the rear a wave of dense smoke that sent us stumbling and blinded into a choking retreat. There was naught to do other than seek a new avenue of escape. The fire and smoke were to be feared 1,000 times over the water, and so I seized upon the first gallery which led out of and up from the suffocating smoke that was engulfing us. Again I stood to one side while the soldiers hastened through on the new way. Some 2,000 must have passed at a rapid run when the stream ceased, but I was not sure that all had been rescued who had not passed the point of origin of the flames, and so to assure myself that no poor devil was left behind to die a horrible death, unsuccored, I ran quickly up the gallery in the direction of the flames, which I could now see burning with a dull glow far ahead. It was hot and stifling work, but at last I reached a point where the fire lit up the corridor sufficiently for me to see that no soldier of Helium lay between me and the conflagration. What was in it or upon the far side I could not know, nor could any man have passed through that seething hell of chemicals and lived to learn. Having satisfied my sense of duty, I turned and ran rapidly back to the corridor through which my men had passed. To my horror, however, I found that my retreat in this direction had been blocked. Across the mouth of the corridor stood a massive steel grating that had evidently been lowered from its resting place above for the purpose of effectually cutting off my escape. That our principal movements were known to the firstborn I could not have doubted, in view of the attack of the fleet upon us the day before. Nor could the stopping of the pumps of Omine at the psychological moment have been due to chance, nor the starting of a chemical combustion within the one corridor through which we were advancing upon the temple of Ishus been due to aught than well-calculated design. And now the dropping of the steel gate to pen me effectually between fire and flood seemed to indicate that invisible eyes were upon us at every moment. What chance had I, then, to rescue Deja Thoris were I to be compelled to fight foes who never showed themselves? 1,000 times I berated myself for being drawn into such a trap, as I might have known these pits easily could be. Now I saw that it would have been much better to have kept our force intact and made a concerted attack upon the temple from the valley side, trusting to chance and our great fighting ability to have overwhelmed the firstborn and compelled the safe delivery of Deja Thoris to me. The smoke from the fire was forcing me further and further back down the corridor toward the waters, which I could hear surging through the darkness. With my men had gone the last torch, nor was this corridor lighted by the radiance of phosphorescent rock as were those of the lower levels. It was this fact that assured me that I was not far from the upper pits which lie directly beneath the temple. Finally I felt the lapping waters about my feet. The smoke was thick behind me. My suffering was intense. There seemed but one thing to do, and that to choose the easier death which confronted me. And so I moved on down the corridor until the cold waters of Omin closed about me, and I swam on through utter blackness toward what? The instinct of self-preservation is strong even when one, unafraid and in the possession of his highest reasoning faculties, knows that death, positive and unalterable, lies just ahead. And so I swam slowly on, waiting for my head to touch the top of the corridor, which would mean that I had reached the limit of my flight and the point where I must sink forever to an unmarked grave. But to my surprise I ran against a blank wall before I reached a point where the waters came to the roof of the corridor. Could I be mistaken? I felt around. No, I had come to the main corridor, and still there was breathing space between the surface of the water and the rocky ceiling above. And then I turned up the main corridor in the direction that Carthoris and the head of the column had passed a half hour before. On and on I swam, my heart growing lighter at every stroke, for I knew that I was approaching closer and closer to the point where there would be no chance that the waters ahead could be deeper than they were about me. I was positive that I must soon feel the solid floor beneath my feet again, and that once more my chance would come to reach the temple of Ishus and the side of the fair prisoner who languished there. But even as hope was at its highest, I felt the sudden shock of contact as my head struck the rocks above. The worst, then, had come to me. I had reached one of those rare places where a Martian tunnel dips suddenly to a lower level. Somewhere beyond I knew that it rose again, but of what value was that to me, since I did not know how great the distance that it maintained a level entirely beneath the surface of the water. There was but a single forlorn hope, and I took it. Filling my lungs with air, I dived beneath the surface and swam through the inky, icy blackness on and on along the submerged gallery. Time and time again I rose with upstretched hand, only to feel the disappointing rocks close above me. Not for much longer would my lungs withstand the strain upon them. I felt that I must soon succumb. Nor was there any retreating now that I had gone this far. I knew positively that I could never endure to retrace my path now to the point from which I had felt the waters close above my head. Death stared me in the face, nor ever can I recall a time that I so distinctly felt the icy breath from his dead lips upon my brow. One more frantic effort I made with my fast-ebbing strength. Weakly I rose for the last time. My tortured lungs gasped for the breath that would fill them with a strange and numbing element. But instead I felt the revivifying breath of life-giving air surge through my starving nostrils into my dying lungs. I was saved. A few more strokes brought me to a point where my feet touched the floor, and soon thereafter I was above the water level entirely, and racing like mad along the corridor, searching for the first doorway that would lead me to Ishus. If I could not have Dejah Thoris again, I was at least determined to avenge her death, nor would any life satisfy me other than that of the fiend incarnate who was the cause of such immeasurable suffering upon Barsoom. Sooner than I had expected I came to what appeared to me to be a sudden exit into the temple above. It was at the right side of the corridor, which ran on, probably, to other entrances to the pile above. To me one point was as good as another. What knew I where any of them led? And so without waiting to be again discovered and thwarted, I ran quickly up the short, steep incline and pushed open the doorway at its end. The portal swung slowly in, and before it could be slammed against me, I sprang into the chamber beyond. Although not yet dawn, the room was brilliantly lighted. Its sole occupant lay prone upon a low couch at the further side, apparently in sleep. From the hangings and sumptuous furniture of the room, I judged it to be a living room of some priestess, possibly of Ishus herself. At the thought, the blood tingled through my veins. What, indeed, if fortune had been kind enough to place the hideous creature alone and unguarded in my hands? With her as hostage, I could force the acquiescence to my every demand. Cautiously I approached the recumbent figure on noiseless feet. Closer and closer I came to it, but I had crossed but little more than half the chamber when the figure stirred, and, as I sprang, rose and faced me. At first an expression of terror overspread the features of the woman who confronted me, then startled, incredulity, hope, thanksgiving. My heart pounded within my breast as I advanced toward her. Tears came to my eyes, and the words that would have poured forth in a perfect torrent choked in my throat as I opened my arms and took into them once more the woman I loved, Ch18, Princess of Helium. End of chapter 21.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the South Shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 22, Victory and Defeat. John Carter, she sobbed, with her dear head upon my shoulder. Even now I can scarce believe the witness of my own eyes. When the girl, Thuvia, told me that you had returned to Barsoom, I listened, but I could not understand, for it seemed that such happiness would be impossible for one who had suffered so, in silent loneliness for all these long years. At last, when I realized that it was truth, and then came to know the awful place in which I was held prisoner, I learned to doubt that even you could reach me here. As the days passed, and moon after moon went by without bringing even the faintest rumor of you, I resigned myself to my fate. And now that you have come, scarce can I believe it. For an hour I have heard the sounds of conflict within the palace. I knew not what they meant, but I have hoped against hope that it might be the men of Helium headed by my prince. And tell me, what of Carthoris, our son? He was with me less than an hour since, Ch18, I replied. It must have been he whose men you have heard battling within the precincts of the temple. Where is Ishis? I asked suddenly. Ch18 shrugged her shoulders. She sent me under guard to this room just before the fighting began within the temple halls. She said that she would send for me later. She seemed very angry and somewhat fearful. Never have I seen her act in so uncertain and almost terrified a manner. Now I know that it must have been because she had learned that John Carter, Prince of Helium, was approaching to demand an accounting of her for the imprisonment of his princess. The sounds of conflict, the clash of arms, the shouting and the hurrying of many feet came to us from various parts of the temple. I knew that I was needed there, but I dared not leave Ch18, nor dared I take her with me into the turmoil and danger of battle. At last I bethought me of the pits from which I had just emerged. Why not secrete her there until I could return and fetch her away in safety and forever from this awful place? I explained my plan to her. For a moment she clung more closely to me. I cannot bear to be parted from you now, even for a moment, John Carter, she said. I shudder at the thought of being alone again where that terrible creature might discover me. You do not know her. None can imagine her ferocious cruelty who has not witnessed her daily acts for over half a year. It has taken me nearly all this time to realize even the things that I have seen with my own eyes. I shall not leave you then, my princess, I replied. She was silent for a moment, then she drew my face to hers and kissed me. Go, John Carter, she said. Our son is there, and the soldiers of Helium, fighting for the Princess of Helium. Where they are, you should be. I must not think of myself now, but of them and of my husband's duty. I may not stand in the way of that. Hide me in the pits and go. I led her to the door through which I had entered the chamber from below. There I pressed her dear form to me, and then, though it tore my heart to do it, and filled me only with the blackest shadows of terrible foreboding, I guided her across the threshold, kissed her once again, and closed the door upon her. Without hesitating longer, I hurried from the chamber in the direction of the greatest tumult. Scarce half a dozen chambers had I traversed before I came upon the theater of a fierce struggle. The blacks were massed at the entrance to a great chamber, where they were attempting to block the further progress of a body of red men toward the inner sacred precincts of the temple. Coming from within as I did, I found myself behind the blacks, and, without waiting to even calculate their numbers or the foolhardiness of my venture, I charged swiftly across the chamber and fell upon them from the rear with my keen longsword. As I struck the first blow, I cried aloud, For Helium! and then I rained cut after cut upon the surprised warriors, while the Reds without took heart at the sound of my voice, and with shouts of "John Carter! John Carter!" redoubled their efforts so effectually that before the blacks could recover from their temporary demoralization, their ranks were broken, and the red men had burst into the chamber. The fight within that room, had it had but a competent chronicler, would go down in the annals of Barsoom as a historic memorial to the grim ferocity of her warlike people. 500 men fought there that day, the black men against the red. No man asked quarter or gave it. As though by common assent they fought, as though to determine once and for all their right to live, in accordance with the law of the survival of the fittest. I think we all knew that upon the outcome of this battle would hinge forever the relative positions of these two races upon Barsoom. It was a battle between the old and the new, but not for once did I question the outcome of it. With Carthoris at my side, I fought for the red men of Barsoom, and for their total emancipation from the throttling bondage of a hideous superstition. Back and forth across the room we surged, until the floor was ankle-deep in blood, and dead men lay so thickly there that half the time we stood upon their bodies as we fought. As we swung toward the great windows which overlooked the gardens of Ishis, a sight met my gaze which sent a wave of exultation over me. "Look!" I cried. "Men of the firstborn, look!" For an instant the fighting ceased, and with one accord every eye turned in the direction I had indicated, and the sight they saw was one no man of the firstborn had ever imagined could be. Across the gardens, from side to side, stood a wavering line of black warriors, while beyond them, and forcing them ever back, was a green horde of green warriors astride their mighty thoats. And as we watched, one, fiercer and more grimly terrible than his fellows, rode forward from the rear, and as he came he shouted some fierce command to his terrible legion. It was Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, and as he couched his great 40-foot metal-shod lance we saw his warriors do likewise. Then it was that we interpreted his command. 20 yards now separated the green men from the black line. Another word from the great Thark, and with a wild and terrifying battle-cry the green warriors charged. For a moment the black line held, but only for a moment. Then the fearsome beasts that bore equally terrible riders passed completely through it. After them came U-tan upon U-tan of red men. The green horde broke to surround the temple. The red men charged for the interior, and then we turned to continue our interrupted battle, but our foes had vanished. My first thought was of Ch18. Calling to Carthoris that I had found his mother, I started on a run toward the chamber where I had left her with my boy close beside me. After us came those of our little force who had survived the bloody conflict. The moment I entered the room, I saw that someone had been there since I had left. A silk lay upon the floor. It had not been there before. There were also a dagger and several metal ornaments strewn about as though torn from their wearer in a struggle. But worst of all, the door leading to the pits where I had hidden my princess was ajar. With a bound I was before it, and thrusting it open, rushed within. Ch18 had vanished. I called her name aloud again and again, but there was no response. I think in that instance I hovered upon the verge of insanity. I do not recall what I said or did, but I know that for an instant I was seized with the rage of a maniac. "Ishis!" I cried. "Ishis! Where is Ishis? Search the temple for her, but let no man harm her but John Carter. Carthoris, where are the apartments of Ishis?" "This way," cried the boy, and without waiting to know that I had heard him, he dashed off at breakneck speed, further into the bowels of the temple. As fast as he went, however, I was still beside him, urging him on to greater speed. At last we came to a great carved door, and through this Carthoris dashed, a foot ahead of me. Within we came upon such a scene as I had witnessed within the temple once before, the throne of Ishis, with the reclining slaves, and about it the ranks of soldiery. We did not even give the men a chance to draw, so quickly were we upon them. With a single cut I struck down 2 in the front rank, and then by the mere weight and momentum of my body I rushed completely through the 2 remaining ranks and sprang upon the dais beside the carved Sorapus throne. The repulsive creature, squatting there in terror, attempted to escape me and leap into a trap behind her, but this time I was not to be outwitted by any such pretty subterfuge. Before she had half arisen, I had grasped her by the arm, and then, as I saw the guards starting to make a concerted rush upon me from all sides, I whipped out my dagger, and, holding it close to that vile breast, ordered them to halt. "Back!" I cried to them. "Back!" The first black foot that is planted upon this platform sends my dagger into Ishus's heart. For an instant they hesitated. Then an officer ordered them back, while from the outer corridor there swept into the throne room, at the heels of my little party of survivors, a full 1,000 red men under Cantos Can, Horvastus, and Exodar. "Where's Ch18?" I cried to the thing within my hands. For a moment her eyes roved wildly about the scene beneath her. I think that it took a moment for the true condition to make any impression upon her. She could not at first realize that the temple had fallen before the assault of men of the outer world. When she did, there must have come to a terrible realization of what it meant to her, the loss of power, humiliation, the exposure of the fraud and imposture which she had for so long played upon her own people. There was just one thing needed to complete the reality of the picture she was seeing, and that was added by the highest noble of her realm, the high priest of her religion, the prime minister of her government. "Ishus, goddess of death and of life eternal," he cried, "arise in the might of thy righteous wrath, and with one single wave of thy omnipotent hand strike dead thy blasphemers. Let not one escape. Ishus, thy people depend upon thee. Daughter of the lesser moon, thou only art all-powerful. Thou only canst save thy people. I am done. We await thy will. Strike!" And then it was that she went mad. A screaming, gibbering maniac writhed in my grasp. It bit and clawed and scratched in impotent fury, and then it laughed a weird, terrible laughter that froze the blood. The slave girls upon the dais shrieked and cowered away, and the thing jumped at them and gnashed its teeth, and then spat upon them from frothing lips. God, but it was a horrid sight. Finally I shook the thing, hoping to recall it for a moment to reality. "Where is Ch18?" I cried again. The awful creature in my grasp mumbled inarticulately for a moment. Then a sudden gleam of cunning shot into those hideous, close-set eyes. "Ch18? Ch18?" Then that shrill, unearthly laugh pierced our ears once more. "Yes, Ch18 I know, and Thuvia, and Theodore, daughter of Mata Shang. They each love John Carter. Ha! But it is drool. Together for a year they will meditate within the temple of the sun, but ere the year is quite gone there will be no more food for them. Ho, ho, what divine entertainment!" And she licked the froth from her cruel lips. "There will be no more food except each other. Ha, ha!" The horror of the suggestion nearly paralyzed me. To this awful fate the creature within my power had condemned my princess. I trembled in the ferocity of my rage. As a terrier shakes a rat, I shook Ishus, goddess of life eternal. "Countermand your orders," I cried. "Recall the condemned. Haste, or you die." "It is too late. Ha, ha!" And then she commenced her gibbering and shrieking again. Almost of its own volition, my dagger flew up above that putrid heart. But something stayed my hand, and I am now glad that it did. It were a terrible thing to have struck down a woman with one's own hand. But a fitter fate occurred to me for this false deity. "Firstborn," I cried, turning to those who stood within the chamber, "you have seen today the impotency of Ishus. The gods are impotent. Ishus is no god. She is a cruel and wicked old woman who has deceived and played upon you for ages. Take her. John Carter, Prince of Helium, would not contaminate his hands with her blood." And with that I pushed the raving beast, whom a short half-hour before a whole world had worshipped as divine, from the platform of her throne into the waiting clutches of her betrayed and vengeful people. Spying Exodar among the officers of the Red Men, I called him to lead me quickly to the Temple of the Sun, and, without waiting to learn what fate the firstborn would wreak upon their goddess, I rushed from the chamber with Exodar, Carthoris, Horvastus, Cantos Can, and a score of other red nobles. The black led us rapidly through the inner chambers of the temple, until we stood within the central court, a great circular space paved with a transparent marble of exquisite whiteness. Before us rose a golden temple wrought in the most wondrous and fanciful designs, inlaid with diamond, ruby, sapphire, turquoise, emerald, and the 1,000 nameless gems of Mars, which far transcend in loveliness and purity of ray the most priceless stones of earth. "This way," cried Exodar, leading us toward the entrance to a tunnel which opened in the courtyard beside the temple. Just as we were on the point of descending, we heard a deep-toned roar burst from the temple of Ishus, which we had but just quitted, and then a red man, Dajor Cantos, Padwar of the 5th Utan, broke from a nearby gate, crying to us to return. "The blacks have fired the temple," he cried. "In 1,000 places it is burning now. Haste to the outer gardens, or you are lost." As he spoke, we saw smoke pouring from a dozen windows looking out upon the courtyard of the Temple of the Sun, and far above the highest minaret of Ishus hung an ever-growing pall of smoke. Go back! I cried to those who had accompanied me. "The way! Exedar, point the way and lead me! I shall reach my princess yet." "Follow me, John Carter," replied Exedar, and without waiting for my reply, he dashed down into the tunnel at our feet. At his heels I ran down through a half-dozen tiers of galleries, until at last he led me along a level floor, at the end of which I discerned a lighted chamber. Massive bars blocked our further progress, but beyond I saw her, my incomparable princess, and with her were Thuvia and Feodor. When she saw me, she rushed toward the bars that separated us. Already the chamber had turned upon its slow way, so far that but a portion of the opening in the temple wall was opposite the barred end of the corridor. Slowly the interval was closing. In a short time there would be but a tiny crack, and then even that would be closed, and for a long Barsoomian year the chamber would slowly revolve until once more, for a brief day, the aperture in its wall would pass the corridor's end. But in the meantime, what horrible things would go on within that chamber? "Exedar," I cried, "can no power stop this awful revolving thing? Is there none who holds the secret of these terrible bars?" "None, I fear, whom we could fetch in time, though I shall go and make the attempt. Wait for me here." After he had left, I stood and talked with Dejah Thoris, as she stretched her dear hand through those cruel bars, that I might hold it until the last moment. Thuvia and Feodor came close also, but when Thuvia saw that we would be alone, she withdrew to the further side of the chamber. Not so the daughter of Matai Shang. "John Carter," she said, "this be the last time that you shall see any of us. Tell me that you love me, that I may die happy." "I love only the Princess of Helium," I replied quietly. "I am sorry, Feodor, but it is as I have told you from the beginning." She bit her lip and turned away, but not before I saw the black and ugly scowl she turned upon Dejah Thoris. Thereafter she stood a little way apart, but not so far as I should have desired, for I had many little confidences to impart to my long-lost love. For a few minutes we stood thus talking in low tones. Ever smaller and smaller grew the opening. In a short time now it would be too small even to permit the slender form of my princess to pass. Oh, why did not Exedar haste? Above we could hear the faint echoes of a great tumult. It was the multitude of black and red and green men fighting their way through the fire from the burning temple of Ishus. A draught from above brought the fumes of smoke to our nostrils. As we stood waiting for Exedar, the smoke became thicker and thicker. Presently we heard shouting at the far end of the corridor and hurrying feet. "Come back, John Carter, come back!" cried a voice. "Even the pits are burning." In a moment a dozen men broke through the now blinding smoke to my side. There was Carthoris, and Cantos Can, and Horvastus, and Exedar, with a few more who had followed me to the temple court. "There is no hope, John Carter," cried Exedar. "The keeper of the keys is dead, and his keys are not upon his carcass. Our only hope is to quench this conflagration and trust to fate that a year will find your princess alive and well. I have brought sufficient food to last them. When this crack closes, no smoke can reach them, and if we hasten to extinguish the flames, I believe they will be safe." "Go then yourself, and take these others with you," I replied. "I shall remain here beside my princess until a merciful death releases me from my anguish. I care not to live." As I spoke, Exedar had been tossing a great number of tiny cans within the prison cell. The remaining crack was not over an inch in width a moment later. Dejah Thoris stood as close to it as she could, whispering words of hope and courage to me, and urging me to save myself. Suddenly, beyond her, I saw the beautiful face of Feodor contorted into an expression of maligned hatred. As my eyes met hers, she spoke. "Think not, John Carter, that you may so lightly cast aside the love of Feodor, daughter of Mata Shang, nor ever hope to hold thy Dejah Thoris in thy arms again. Wait you the long, long year, but know that when the waiting is over, it shall be Feodor's arms which shall welcome you, not those of the Princess of Helium. Behold, she dies." And as she finished speaking, I saw her raise a dagger on high, and then I saw another figure. It was Thuvia's. As the dagger fell toward the unprotected breast of my love, Thuvia was almost between them. A blinding gust of smoke blotted out the tragedy within that fearsome cell. A shriek rang out, a single shriek as the dagger fell. The smoke cleared away. but we stood gazing upon a blank wall. The last crevice had closed, and for a long year that hideous chamber would retain its secret from the eyes of men. They urged me to leave. "In a moment it will be too late," cried Exedar. "There is, in fact, but a bare chance that we can come through to the outer gate alive even now. I have ordered the pumps started, and in 5 minutes the pits will be flooded. If we would not drown like rats in a trap, we must hasten above and make a dash for safety through the burning temple." "Go," I urged them. "Let me die here beside my princess. There is no hope or happiness elsewhere for me. When they carry her dear body from that terrible place a year hence, let them find the body of her lord awaiting her." Of what happened after that I have only a confused recollection. It seems as though I struggled with many men, and then that I was picked up bodily from the ground and borne away. I do not know. I have never asked, nor has any other who was there that day intruded on my sorrow, or recalled to my mind the occurrences which they know could but at best reopen the terrible wound within my heart. Ah, if I could but know one thing, what a burden of suspense would be lifted from my shoulders! But whether the assassin's dagger reached one fair bosom or another, only time will divulge. End of Chapter 22, and end of Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs.